Next Level Soul Publishing presents Mystic Christianity, The Inner Teachings of the Master by Yogi Ramacharaka. Read by William Sterling. Introduction. In the dim corridors of time, where echoes of spiritual truth have reverberated for millennia, there exists a path that winds between the seen and unseen, the tangible and the transcendent. Mystic Christianity is not a book to be read lightly. It is a guidepost to the eternal, a whisper from the ancient halls of wisdom, calling to those who seek the mysteries of Christ not as a distant figure on a gilded throne, but as a living presence within the soul. Mystic Christianity reveals a truth often hidden from the orthodox mind, a truth that speaks to the inner temple where consciousness meets divinity. Yogi Ramacharaka, the author of this profound work, invites us not only to explore the life and teachings of Jesus, but to rediscover what his message truly means when stripped of the dogma and rigid structures that have calcified around it over centuries. It is no coincidence that this next-level soul edition arrives now, a beacon for those navigating the turbulent currents of modern existence, seeking a deeper connection with their inner selves and the divine. In this unique edition, we have included chapter summaries, key points, and action items to help you integrate the wisdom of mystic Christianity into your daily life. These editions are not merely intellectual exercises. They are practical steps designed to awaken your soul and attune your spirit to the hidden frequencies of truth. The Lost Wisdom of the Master. The story of Jesus, as presented in mystic Christianity, is far richer than the surface-level narrative often portrayed. Here we discover a Jesus deeply immersed in the mystical traditions of his time, a master of occult wisdom, a healer, a seer, and a teacher of universal truths. The text reveals how Jesus' message transcends doctrine and dogma, inviting us to embrace the living Christ within. His journey is one of self-mastery, a path we are each called to follow. The power of inner transformation. In these pages, you will encounter profound insights into the hidden teachings of Jesus, truths long safeguarded by the Essenes, the Magi, and other mystery schools of the ancient world. Concepts like the divine immanence, the mystery of the virgin birth, and the power of spiritual consciousness are revealed not as distant philosophical ideas, but as vibrant forces that shape our inner worlds. Awakening to Christ within. This next-level soul edition is more than just a book. It is an invitation to embark on an inner pilgrimage. Each chapter's summary distills the core message of the text, while the key points illuminate essential spiritual lessons. Most importantly, the action items offer you practical exercises to incorporate these teachings into your life, empowering you to deepen your spiritual practice and expand your awareness. The Call of the Seeker. Whether you are new to spiritual exploration or have walked the path for years, mystic Christianity will challenge you to expand your understanding of Christ's message. This is not the Christ of blind belief, but the Christ of inner awakening, a radiant presence that dwells within you, waiting to be realized. Jesus' true mission was not to establish a religion, but to awaken consciousness, to ignite the divine flame within every soul. His teachings are not chains that bind. They are keys that unlock the doors of perception. In a world clamoring for certainty and structure, his invitation remains the same. The kingdom of God is within you. It is my hope that this next-level soul edition of Mystic Christianity will illuminate your path, inspire your heart, and awaken the sacred light within. May you read not only with your mind, but with your soul, seeking not merely to understand, but to become. Prepare to step beyond the threshold of belief into the vast expanse of spiritual knowing. The mysteries await those with eyes to see. Lesson 1. The Coming of the Master, the Forerunner. Strange rumors reached the ears of the people of Jerusalem and the surrounding country. It was reported that a new prophet had appeared in the valley of the lower Jordan and in the wilderness of northern Judea, preaching startling doctrines. His teachings resembled those of the prophets of old, and his cry of, "Repent! Repent ye, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand," awakened strange memories of the ancient teachers of the race and caused the common people to gaze wonderingly at each other and the ruling classes to frown and look serious when the name of the new prophet was mentioned. The man whom the common people called a prophet, and whom the exalted ones styled an impostor, was known as John the Baptist, and dwelt in the wilderness away from the accustomed haunts of men. He was clad in the rude garments of the roaming ascetics, his rough robe of camel's skin being held around his form by a coarse girdle of leather. His diet was frugal and elemental, consisting of the edible locust of the region, together with the wild honey stored by the bees of the wilderness. In appearance, John, whom men called the Baptist, was tall, wiry, and rugged. His skin was tanned a dark brown by the winds and sun which beat upon it unheeded. His long black hair hung loosely around his shoulders and was tossed like the mane of a lion when he spoke. His beard was rough and untrimmed. His eyes gleamed like glowing coals and seemed to burn into the very soul of his hearers. His was the face of the religious enthusiastic with a message for the world. This wild prophet was most strenuous, and his teachings were couched in the most vigorous words. There was no tact, policy, or persuasion in his message. He hurled his verbal thunderbolts right into his crowd, the very force and earnestness emanating from him serving to charge his words with a vitality and magnetism which dashed itself into the crowd like a spark of electricity, knocking men from off their feet and driving the truth into them as if by a charge of a powerful explosive. He told them that the spiritual grain was to be gathered into the garners, while the chaff was to be consumed as if by a fiery furnace, that the axe was to be laid to the root of the trees, which brought not forth good fruit. Verily, the day of Jehovah, long promised by the prophets, was near to hand to his hearers and followers. John soon gathered to himself a following, the people flocking to him from all parts of the country, even from Galilee. His followers began to talk among themselves, asking whether indeed this man were not the long-promised Master, the Messiah for whom all Israel had waited for centuries. This talk, coming to the ears of the prophet, caused him to answer the question in his discourses, saying, "There cometh one mightier than I after me, the latchet of whose shoes I am not worthy to stoop down and unloose. He that cometh after me is mightier than I." And thus it became gradually known to his following, and the strangers attending his meetings, that this John the Baptist, mighty preacher though he be, was but the herald of one much greater than he, who should follow, that he was the forerunner of the Master, according to the Oriental imagery which pictured the forerunner of the great dignitaries running ahead of the chariot of his Master, crying aloud to all people gathered on the road that they must make way for the approaching great man, shouting constantly, "Make ye a way! Make ye a way for the Lord!" And accordingly, there was a new wave of excitement among John's following, which spread rapidly to the surrounding country, at this promise of the coming of the Lord, the Master, perhaps even the Messiah of the Jews. And many more came unto John, and with him waited for the coming of the Master. This John the Baptist was born in the hill country of Judea, nearly 30 years before he appeared as a prophet. His father was of the priestly order, or temple caste, who had reached an advanced age, and who lived with his aged wife in retirement, away from the noise and confusion of the world, waiting the gradual approach of that which cometh to all men alike. Then there came to them a child of their old age, unexpected and unhoped for, coming as a mark of especial favor from God, a son, to whom they gave the name of Johanan, which in the Hebrew tongue means Jehovah is gracious. Reared in the home of his parents, the house of a priest, John saturated himself with all the inner teachings reserved for the few and withheld from the masses. The secrets of the Kabbalah, that system of Hebrew occultism and mysticism in which the higher priests of Judea were well versed, were disclosed to him, and occult tradition has it that he was initiated into the inner circle of the Hebrew mystics, composed of only priests of a certain grade and their sons. John became an occultist and a mystic. When the boy reached the age of puberty, he departed from the home of his parents and went into the wilderness, looking to the east, from whence cometh all light. In other words, he became an ascetic, living in the wilderness, just as in India even today youths of the Brahmin or priestly class sometimes forsake their homes, renouncing their luxurious life, and fly to the jungle, where they wander about for years as ascetics, wearing a single garment, subsisting on the most elementary food, and developing their spiritual consciousness. John remained a recluse until he reached the age of about 30 years, when he emerged from the wilderness to preach the coming of the Lord, in obedience to the moving of the Spirit. Let us see where he was and what he did during the 15 years of his life in the wilderness and hidden places of Judea. The traditions of the Essenes, preserved among occultists, state that while John was an ascetic, he imbibed the teachings of that strange occult brotherhood known as the Essenes, and after having served his apprenticeship, was accepted into the order as an initiate, and attained their higher degrees reserved only for those of developed spirituality and power. It is said that even when he was a mere boy, he claimed and proved his right to be fully initiated into the mysteries of the order, and was believed to have been a reincarnation of one of the old Hebrew prophets. The Essenes. The Essenes were an ancient Hebrew occult brotherhood, which had been in existence many hundred years before John's time. They had their headquarters on the eastern shores of the Dead Sea, although their influence extended over all of Palestine, and their ascetic brothers were to be found in every wilderness. The requirements of the order were very strict, and its rites and ceremonies were of the highest mystical and occult degree. The neophyte was required to serve a preliminary apprenticeship of 1 year before being admitted to even partial recognition as a member and brother. A further apprenticeship of 2 more years was required before he was admitted to full membership and extended the right hand of fellowship. Additional time was required for further advancement, and even time alone did not entitle the member to certain high degrees, the requirements being that actual knowledge, power, and attainment must first be manifested. As in all true occult orders, the candidate must work out his own salvation, neither money nor influence having any weight. Absolute obedience to the rules of the order, absolute poverty of material possessions, absolute sexual continence. These were the conditions of membership to be observed by both neophyte and initiate, as well as high-degree master. Understanding this, one may imagine the disgust inspired in John by the amorous solicitations of Salome, which caused him to lose his life rather than to break the vows of his order, as is so startlingly pictured in the stage productions of modern times. One of the ceremonies of the Essenes was that of baptism, literally dipping in water, which was administered to candidates with appropriate solemnity and rites. The mystic significance of the ceremony, which is understood by all members of occult orders even unto this day, was a part of the ritual originated by the Essenes, and the rite itself was a distinctive feature of their order. The performance of this rite by John the Baptist in his ministry and its subsequent acceptance by the Christian Church as a distinctive ceremonial, of which the sprinkling of infants of today is a reminder and substitute, forms a clear connecting link between the Essenes and modern Christianity, and impresses the stamp of mysticism and occultism firmly upon the latter, as little as the general public may wish to admit it in their ignorant misunderstanding and materialistic tendencies. The Essenes believed in and taught the doctrine of reincarnation, the immanence of God, and many other occult truths, the traces of which appear constantly in the Christian teachings, as we shall see as we progress with these lessons. Through its exalted brother, John the Baptist, the order passed on its teaching to the early Christian Church, thus grafting itself permanently upon a new religious growth, newly appearing on the scene. And the transplanted branches are still there. Of course, the true history of the real connection between the Essenes and Christianity is to be found only in the traditions of the Essenes and other ancient mystic orders, much of which has never been printed, but which has passed down from teacher to pupil over the centuries even unto this day among occult fraternities. But in order to show the student that we are not making statements incapable of proof by evidence available to him, we would refer him to any standard work of reference on the subject. For instance, if he will consult the New International Encyclopedia, Volume 7, page 217. Article on Essenes, he will read the following words. It is an interesting question as to how much Christianity owes to Essenism. It would seem that there was room for definite contact between John the Baptist and this brotherhood. His time of preparation was spent in the wilderness near the Dead Sea. His preaching of righteousness toward God and justice toward one's fellow men was in agreement with Essenism, while his insistence on baptism was in accord with the Essenic emphasis on lustrations. The same article contains the statement that the Essenic Brotherhood taught a certain view entertained regarding the origin, present state, and future destiny of the soul, which was held to be pre-existent, being entrapped in the body as in a prison, etc. The above italics are our own. John emerged from the wilderness when he had reached the age of about 30 years and began his ministry work, which extended for several years until his death at the hands of Herod. He gathered around him a large and enthusiastic following, beginning with the humbler classes and afterward embracing a number of higher social degree. He formed his more advanced followers into a band of disciples, with prescribed rules regarding fasting, worship, ceremonial, rites, etc., closely modeled upon those favored by the Essenes. This organization was continued until the time of John's death, when it merged with the followers of Jesus and exerted a marked influence upon the early Christian Church. As we have stated, one of his principal requisites enjoined upon all of his followers was that of baptism, the Essenic rite, from which he derived his familiar appellation, the Baptist. But it must be remembered that to John this rite was a most sacred, mystic, symbolic ceremony, possessing a deep occult meaning unperceived by many of his converts, who submitted themselves to it under the fervor of religious emotion, and who naively regarded it as some magical rite which washed away sin from their souls, as the dirt was washed from their bodies, a belief which seems to be still in favor with the multitude. John worked diligently at his mission, and the Baptists, or followers of Johannan, as they were called, increased rapidly. His meetings were events of great moment to thousands who had gathered from all Palestine to see and hear the prophet of the wilderness, the Essene who had emerged from his retirement. His meetings were often attended with startling occurrences, sudden conversions, visions, trances, etc., and many developed possessions of unusual powers and faculties. But one day there was held a meeting destined to gain worldwide fame. This was the day when there came to John the Baptist the Master, of whose coming John had frequently foretold and promised. Jesus the Christ appeared upon the scene and confronted his forerunner. The traditions have it that Jesus came unannounced to and unrecognized by John and the populace. The forerunner was in ignorance of the nature and degree of his guest and applicant for baptism. Although the two were cousins, they had not met since childhood, and John did not at first recognize Jesus. The traditions of the mystic orders further state that Jesus then gave to John the various signs of the occult fraternities to which they both belonged, working from the common signs up until Jesus passed on to degrees to which John had not attained, although he was an eminent high-degree Essene. Whereupon John saw that the man before him was no common applicant for baptism, but was, instead, a highest-degree mystic adept and occult master, his superior in rank and unfoldment. John, perceiving this, remonstrated with Jesus, saying that it was not meet and proper, nor in accordance with the customs of the brotherhoods, for the inferior to baptize the superior. Of this event, the New Testament takes note in these words, "But John forbade him, saying, I have need to be baptized of thee, and comest thou to me?" Matthew 3:14. But Jesus insisted that John perform the rite upon him upon the ground that he wished to go through the ceremonial in order to set his stamp of approval upon it, and to show that he considered himself as a man among men, come forth to live the life of men. In both the occult traditions and the New Testament narrative, it is stated that a mystical occurrence ensued at the baptism, the Spirit of God descending like a dove and lighting upon him, and a voice from heaven saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." And with these words, the mission of John the Baptist, as forerunner of the Master, was fulfilled. The Master had appeared to take up his work. The Master. And now, let us turn back the pages of the Book of Time, to a period about 30 years before the happening of the events above mentioned. Let us turn our gaze upon the events surrounding the birth of Jesus, in order that we may trace the mystic and occult forces at work from the beginning of Christianity. There are occurrences of the greatest importance embraced in these 30 years. Let us begin the mystic narrative of Jesus the Christ, as it is told to the neophyte of every occult order, by the master instructor, by a recital of an event preceding his birth by over 1 year. In Matthew 2:1-2, the following is related. Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and are come to worship him. In these simple words is stated an event that, expressed in a much more extended narrative, forms an important part of the esoteric teachings of the mystic brotherhoods and occult orders of the Orient, and which is also known to the members of the affiliated secret orders of the Western world. The story of the Magi is embedded in the traditions of the Oriental mystics, and we shall here give you a brief outline of the story as it is told by Hierophant to neophyte, by guru to chela. To understand the story, you must know just who were these wise men of the East, the Magi, and this you shall now be taught. The Magi, or wise men. The translators of the New Testament have translated the words naming these visitors from afar as the wise men from the East. But in the original Greek, Matthew used the words the Magi, as may be seen by reference to the original Greek versions, or the Revised Translation, which gives the Greek term in a footnote. Any leading encyclopedia will corroborate this statement. The term the Magi was the exact statement of Matthew in the original Greek in which the Gospel was written, the term the wise men originating with the English translators. There is absolutely no dispute regarding this question among biblical scholars, although the general public is not aware of the connection, nor do they identify the wise men with the Oriental Magians. The word magi comes to the English language direct from the Greek, which in turn acquired it by gradual steps from the Persian, Chaldean, Median, and Assyrian tongues. It means, literally, wonder worker, and was applied to the members of the occult priestly orders of Persia, Media, and Chaldea, who were mystic adepts and occult masters. Ancient history is full of references to this body of men. They were the custodians of the world's occult knowledge for centuries, and the priceless treasures of the inner teachings held by the race today have come through the hands of these men, the Magi, who tended the sacred fires of mysticism and kept the flame burning. In thinking of their task, one is reminded of the words of Edward Carpenter, the poet, who sings, "Oh, let not the flame die out, cherished age after age in its dark caverns, in its holy temples cherished, fed by pure ministers of love, let not the flame die out." The title of Magi was highly esteemed in those ancient days, but it fell into disrepute in the latter times owing to its growing use as an appellation of the practitioners of black magic, or evil wonder workers, or sorcerers of those days. But as a writer in the New International Encyclopedia, Volume 12, page 674, has truly said, "The term is employed in its true sense by Matthew 2:1 of the wise men who came from the east to Jerusalem to worship Christ." The significance of this event must be observed because the Messianic doctrine was an old and established one in Zoroastrianism. The same article says of the Magi, they believed in a resurrection, a future life, and the advent of a Savior. To understand the nature of the Magi in connection with their occult wonder-working, we must turn to the dictionaries, where we will see that the word magic is derived from the title magi, the word magician having been originally magian, which means one of the magi. Webster defines the word magic as follows: the hidden wisdom supposed to be possessed by the magi, relating to the occult powers of nature, mastery of secret forces in nature, etc. So you may readily see that we are right in stating to you that these wise men, the Magi who came to worship the Christ child, were in reality the representatives of the great mystic brotherhoods and occult orders of the Orient, adepts, masters, hierophants, and thus do we find the occult and mystic wonder-workers, the high-degree brethren of the great Eastern lodges of mystic occultism, appearing at the very beginning of the story of Christianity, indicating their great interest in the mortal birth of the greater Master, whose coming they had long waited, the Master of Masters. And all occultists and mystics find pleasure and just pride in the fact that the first recognition of the divine nature of this human child came from these Magi from the East, from the very heart of the mystic inner circles. To those so-called Christians, to whom all that is connected with mysticism and occultism savors of the fiery sulfur and brimstone, we would call attention to this intimate early relation between the musters and the master. The star in the east. But the mystic story begins still further back than the visit of the Magi to Bethlehem. Did not the Magi say, "Where is he? We have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him"? What is meant by the words, "We have seen his star in the east"? To the majority of Christians, the Star of Bethlehem means a great star that suddenly appeared in the heavens, like a great beacon light, and which miraculously guided the steps of the Magi, mile by mile, on their weary journey, until at last it rested in the heavens, stationary over the house in which the child Jesus lived, between the ages of 1 and 2 years. In other words, they believed that this star had constantly guided these skilled mystics, occultists, and astrologers in their journey from the Far East, which occupied over a year, until it at last guided them to Bethlehem, and then stopped stationary over the house of Joseph and Mary. Alas, that these vulgar traditions of the ignorant multitude should have served so long to obscure a beautiful mystic occurrence, and which by their utter improbability and unscientific nature should have caused thousands to sneer at the very true legend of the Star of Bethlehem. It remains for the mystic traditions to clear away the clouds of ignorance from this beautiful story, and to re-establish it in the minds of men as a natural and scientific occurrence. This story of the traveling star arose from the superstitious and ignorant ideas of many of the Christians of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries after Christ's death. These tales were injected into the manuscripts left by the disciples, and soon began to be regarded as a part and portion of the authentic Gospels and epistles, although the skilled biblical critics and scholars of today are rapidly discarding many of these additions as willful forgeries and interpolations. It must be remembered that the oldest manuscripts of the books of the New Testament are known to biblical scholars to have been written not less than 300 years after the time of the original writing, and are merely copies of the originals, undoubtedly added to, altered, and adulterated by the writers through whose hands they had passed. This is not merely the statement of an outside critic. It is a fact that is clearly stated in the writings of the scholars in the churches engaged in the work of biblical study, and the higher criticism, to which works we refer any who may have reason to doubt our statement. That portion of the verse, Matthew 2:9, in which it is said that, "And lo, the star which they saw in the east went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was," is known to the mystic and occult orders to be a rank interpolation into the story of the Magi. It is contrary to their own traditions and records, and is also contrary to reason and to scientific laws, and this distorted story alone has been the cause of the development of thousands of infidels who could not accept the tale. All intelligent men know that a star is not a mere tiny point of flame in the dome which shuts us out from a heaven on the other side of the blue shell, although this view was that of the ancient people and many ignorant men and women today. Educated people know that a star is either a planet of our solar system, similar to the sister planet which we called the Earth, or else is a mighty sun, probably many times larger than our sun, countless millions of miles distant from our solar system. And they know that planets have their invariable orbits and courses, over which they travel unceasingly, so true to their course that their movements may be foretold centuries ahead or calculated for centuries back. And they know that even the great fixed stars, those distant suns and centers of great solar systems akin to our own, have their own places in the universe, also their universal relations and movements. All who have studied even the most elementary school book on astronomy know these things. And yet such people are asked to swallow whole this story of the moving star, traveling on a little ahead of the shepherds for over a year, and at last standing right over the home of Jesus, and thus indicating that the search was ended. Let us compare this unscientific tale with the traditions and legends of the mystics, and then take your choice. Had there been any such star in appearance, the historians of that day would surely have recorded it, for there were learned and wise men in the East in those days, and as astrology was a science closely studied, it would have been noted and passed on to posterity by both writings and tradition. But no such record or tradition is to be found among the Eastern peoples, or the records of the astrologers. But another record and tradition is preserved, as we shall see in a moment. Yes, there really was a Star of Bethlehem, which led the feet of the Magi to the home of the infant Jesus. We have the following proof of this fact. 1. The traditions and teachings of the mystic orders which have been handed down from teacher to student for centuries. 2. the statements and records of the ancient astrologers, which may be proven by modern astronomical calculations, and 3. The calculations made by modern astronomers, which shall be stated a few paragraphs further on. These three sources of information give us the same tale, as we shall see. Before proceeding to a consideration of this threefold evidence, let us pause for a moment and consider the relation of the Magi to astrology. To understand the narrative of the Magi's visit to Jesus, we must remember that they were the very masters of astrological lore. Persia and the surrounding Oriental countries were the fountainhead of astrological teaching, and these Magi were masters and adepts and hierophants, and consequently knew all that was known to the greatest schools of astrology of that day. Much of their ancient astrological lore has been lost to the race of today, but to these ancient learned men it was as much of a science as chemistry and astronomy are to the learned ones of our day. The Magi had long waited for the appearance and incarnation of a great master of masters, whose appearance had been predicted centuries before by some of the great occult fathers of the mystic orders, and each generation hoped that the event would come in his day. They had been taught that when the event took place, they would be informed by means of the planets, according to the higher astrology. All students of even our modern fragmentary astrology will understand this, and so they waited and carefully scanned the heavens for the sign. Now the traditions of the occult orders inform us that at last the Magi witnessed a peculiar conjunction of planets. First, the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter in the constellation of Pisces, the two planets being afterward joined by the planet Mars, the three planets in close relation of position, making a startling and unusual stellar display, and having a deep astrological significance. Now, the constellation of Pisces, as all astrologers, ancient and modern, know, is the constellation governing the national existence of Judea. Seeing the predicted conjunction of the planets occurring in the constellation having to do with Judea, as well as the relative positions of the other planets, all of which played its part in the observation, the Magi knew two things, i.e., 1, that the birth of the Master of Masters had occurred, and 2, that he had been born in Judea, as indicated by the constellation in which the conjunction occurred. And so, making the calculation of the exact moment of the conjunction, they started on their long journey toward Judea in search of the Master of Masters. Now, again, the records of the astrologers, preserved in the Oriental occult brotherhoods, in their monasteries, etc., show that at a period a few years before the Christian era, such a peculiar conjunction and combination of the planets occurred in the constellation symbolizing the destinies of Judea, which was interpreted as indicating the appearance of an incarnation or avatar of a great divine soul, a master of masters, a mystic of mystics. It must be remembered that these orders are composed of non-Christians, people that the average Christian would call heathens, and that therefore this testimony must be regarded as free from bias toward Christianity or the corroboration of its legends. And, in the third place, the calculations of modern astronomy show without possibility of contradiction that in the Roman year 747, or 7 years before the Christian era, the planets Saturn and Jupiter formed a conjunction in the constellation of Pisces, and that these two planets, still in close position to each other, were joined by the planet Mars in the spring of 748. The great astronomer Kepler first made this calculation in the year 1604, and it has been since verified by modern calculations. To those who would object that all this occurred 7 years before the commonly accepted date of the birth of Christ, we would say that any modern work on New Testament chronology, or any encyclopedia or reference work on the subject, will show that the former calculations were several years out of the way, and that the records of other events mentioned in the Bible, such as the enrollment of the people, which brought Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem, enable modern biblical scholars to fix the date of the birth of Christ at about 6 or 7 years before the usually accepted time, so that modern research fully corroborates the astrological record and the mystic traditions. And so it would appear that the coming of the wise men, the Magi, was in accordance with the astrological signs, of the interpretation of which they were adepts and masters. When this truth is known, how puerile and petty seems the myth of the traveling star of the commonly accepted exoteric version, and the pictures of the wise men being led by a moving heavenly body, traveling across the skies, and at last standing still over the cottage of Joseph, with which the Sunday school books are filled, must be relegated to the same waste-paper basket which contains the Bible illustrations, formerly so popular, which picture Jehovah as a bald-headed old man with a long white beard, clad in flowing robes designed to hide his body. Is it any wonder that skeptics, infidels, and scoffers of the spiritual truths have arisen in great numbers when they have been asked to accept these things or be damned? And is not this connection of astrology with early Christianity a rebuke to the modern Christian church, which sneers and scoffs at the science of astrology as a base superstition fit only for fools and ignoramuses? Does not this picture of the Magi give a clear view of that which was formerly regarded as a mere fable, to be solemnly smiled over and taught to the children, with whom the story has always been a favorite, owing to their intuitive perception of an underlying truth? And now, with this mystic version, cannot you enjoy the legend with the children? In this connection, let us once more quote from the New International Encyclopedia, Volume 2170, a standard reference work, as you know, which says, "Some of the earlier Christian fathers argued against the doctrines of the earlier astrology, while others received them in a modified form, and indeed it formed a part of the basis of their religion in the gospel narrative of the visit to Bethlehem of the wise men of the East, who were Chaldean magi or astrologers." Here is the testimony in all of the standard reference books, and yet how many of you have known it? To understand the importance of the event which drew the steps of the Magi to Bethlehem, we must realize that the coming of the Master was a favorite subject of speculation and discussion among occultists and mystic organizations all over the Oriental countries. It had been foretold in all tongues that a great Master would be given to the world, a mighty avatar or appearance of deity in human form, who would incarnate in order to redeem the world from the materiality which threatened it. The sacred writings of India, Persia, Chaldea, Egypt, Media, Assyria, and other lands had foretold this event for many centuries, and all the mystics and occultists longed for the day when the Master would appear. The Jews also had many traditions regarding the coming of a Messiah, who would be born of the seed of David at Bethlehem, but their Messiah was looked upon as likely to be an earthly king, destined to free Israel from the Roman yoke. And so, the tradition of the Jews was regarded as of inferior moment to their own predictions by the mystic and occult brotherhoods of the East. To them, it was to be an avatar of deity, God in human form come to take his rightful seat as the Grand Master of the Universal Grand Lodge of Mystic, a descent of pure spirit into matter. This conception certainly was very much higher than that of the Jews. And so, knowing these things, we may readily understand why the Magi pursued their search with such ardor and enthusiasm. They had many weary miles of travel to Bethlehem, over a year being consumed in the journey. They reached Bethlehem over a year after the birth of Christ and the appearance of the star, the sight of which had started them on their quest. They sought not a newborn babe, as common belief has it. They searched for a child born over a year before. We refer the student to any reference work for a verification of this last statement. The illustrations in the Sunday school books showing the wise men worshipping a newborn babe in the manger are on a par with the others mentioned. The wise men had nothing to do with the stable or the manger, for Joseph, Mary, and the babe were lodged in a house by that time, as we shall see as we proceed. At last, after their long and weary wandering over hill and plain, mountain and desert, the Magi found themselves in Jerusalem, inquiring diligently as to the whereabouts of the Master of Masters, the Promised One, whose coming had been the subject of prophecy for centuries among the Eastern peoples. The Jews of whom they inquired, although not familiar with the predictions regarding a mystic master or avatar of deity, were nevertheless thoroughly familiar with the prophecies of the coming of the Hebrew Messiah, and naturally thought that it was of this expected earthly king of the Jews that the Magi inquired, and so they reported it far and wide that these great men from the East had come to Jerusalem to find the Messiah, the King of the Jews, who was to deliver Israel from the Roman yoke. And, as the Gospel of Matthew 2:3 informs us, when Herod the king heard it, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Naturally so, when it is remembered that it was an earthly kingdom that they expected the Messiah would inherit. And so, gathering the chief priests and scribes of Jerusalem around him, he bade them tell him the particulars regarding the prophecies regarding the Messiah, where he was expected to be born. And they answered him, saying, In Bethlehem of Judea, for so hath the prophet spoken. And hearing the testimony of the scribes and priests, the wily Herod, who feared the realization of this old Hebrew prophecy, which threatened to cost him his throne if fulfilled, called the Magi to his palace, and in private consultation inquired of them the reason of their search. And when they told him of the astrological indications of the star, he was still more wrought up and wished to locate the dangerous child. And so he inquired of them the exact date at which the star had appeared, that he might be better able to find the infant, knowing its date of birth in Bethlehem. See Matthew 2:7. And learning this, he bade them go to Bethlehem and find the child they sought, and cunningly added, And when ye have found him, bring me word, that I also may come and worship him. Thus, craftily concealing his intentions to seize and kill the child, he endeavored to press the Magi into his service as detectives by pretending to join in their desire to locate the divine child. The Magi traveled on to Bethlehem, and arriving there made diligent inquiry regarding infants that had been born about the time that the star appeared. There were many infants born in Bethlehem during the same month, of course, and the search was difficult. But they soon heard strange rumors about a babe that had been born to travelers in Bethlehem about that time, the birth of whom had been attended by a strange occurrence. This peculiar happening is related in Luke 2:8-20, in which it is stated that at the time of the birth of Jesus in the manger, certain shepherds keeping the night watch over their flocks saw an angel standing by them, and the glory of the Lord shining around about them. And the angel bade them be not afraid, for to them was to be given tidings of great joy, for there was born that very day, in Bethlehem, one who was to be the anointed Lord of the world. And the angel further directed them that the babe would be found lying in a manger in a stable, wrapped in swaddling clothes, which was to be their sign. And then suddenly the place was filled with a multitude of supernatural beings, praising God, singing, Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace and goodwill among men. And the shepherds flocked to the town, and there found the child in the manger. And they spread abroad the report of the wonderful event accompanying the birth of the child. And consequently, the child and its parents became objects of more or less public interest. And so, when the Magi instituted their search, they were in due time informed of this strange occurrence. And they visited the house of Joseph and Mary, and saw the babe. Making close inquiry of the parents, they found that the time of the child's birth tallied precisely with the moment of the astrological signs. Then they cast the child's horoscope, and they knew that their shepherd's vision coincided with their own science, and that here indeed was he for whom the Eastern occultists and mystics had waited for centuries. They had found the Master. The star child was before them. Then these great men of their own lands, these adepts, masters, and hierophants, prostrated themselves on the ground before the child and gave him the salutation due only to the great occult Master of Masters, who was come to take his seat upon the throne of the Grand Master of the Great Lodge. But the child knew naught of this, and merely smiled sweetly at these strange men in gorgeous foreign robes, and reached out his little hand toward them. But occult tradition has it that the tiny fingers and thumb of his right hand, outstretched toward the Magi, unconsciously assumed the mystic symbol of the occult benediction, used by the masters and hierophants, and now used by the Pope in papal benediction, and gave to the worshippers that Master's benediction. The tiny Master of Masters thus gave his first blessing to his followers and exalted worshippers. But his throne was not that of the Great Lodge, but a still higher place, the knees of a mother. And the Magi then made mystic and symbolic offerings to the child. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh offered they him. Gold, signifying the tribute offered to a ruler, was the first symbol. Then came frankincense, the purest and rarest incense used by the occult and mystic brotherhoods and orders, in their ceremonies and rites, when they were contemplating the sacred symbol of the absolute Master of the universe. This frankincense was their symbol of worship. Then, last symbol of all, was the myrrh, which in the occult and mystic symbolism indicated the bitterness of mortal life, bitter though pungent, preserving though stinging. This was the meaning of the myrrh, that this child, though divine in his inner nature, was still mortal in body and brain, and must accept and experience the bitter tang of life. Myrrh, the strength of which preserves and prevents decay, and yet which smarts and tangs and stings ever and ever. A worthy symbol of mortal life, surely. Wise men indeed, ye Magi. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh, a prophecy, symbol, and revelation of the life of the Son of Man, with his indwelling pure spirit. And the Magi, having performed their rites and ceremonies, departed from Bethlehem. But they did not forget the child. They preserved a careful watch over his movements until they saw him again. Saw him again? You ask? Yes, saw him again. Though the Gospels say naught of this and are silent for a period of many years in the life of Jesus, yet the records and traditions of the mystics of the East are filled with this esoteric knowledge of these missing years, as we shall see as we proceed. Left behind by the Magi, but still under their loving care, the child waxed strong and grew in mind and body. But the Magi, being warned by higher intelligences in a vision, did not return to the wily and crafty Herod, but departed unto their own country another way. Matthew 2:12. And Herod waited in vain for their return, and finally discovering their escape, wrathfully ordered the massacre of all male children that had been born in Bethlehem and its suburbs of 2 years of age and under. He calculated the 2 years from the witnessing of the star by the Magi. Matthew 2:16 states the story of the fixing of the time as follows: And slew all the male children that were in Bethlehem, and all the borders thereof, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he exactly learned of the wise men. Herod sought to kill the feared Messiah, the King of the Jews, who threatened to drive him from his earthly throne, by killing all the male infants in Bethlehem that had been born since the astrological indication as stated by the Magi. But this plot failed, for Joseph had been warned by An angel in a dream, which mystics teach was the astral form of one of the Magi, and was told to take the mother and child and flee into Egypt, and to stay there until the death of Herod. And so Joseph, Mary, and Jesus then fled from the wrath of Herod, and stole silently away to Egypt. And the occult traditions have it that the expenses of the journey of this poor carpenter and his family, that journey into strange lands, hurried, and without the chance to earn money along the way, was accomplished by the means of the gold that the Magi had offered to Jesus, and which they had insisted upon his parents storing away for his use. And so the gold of these occult mystics saved the founder of Christianity from massacre. And how poorly has Christianity repaid the debt, when one thinks of the persecutions of the Oriental heathen by the so-called Christians of all times. And note this, they carried the child to Egypt, the home of mystery and occultism, the land of Isis, a worthy resting place for the great occult master that was to be. And occult tradition also has it that one night, wearied with their long journey, the family halted and passed the night in the place of the Sphinx and pyramids, and that the mother and babe rested between the outstretched forepaws of the mighty Sphinx, which held them safe and secure, while Joseph threw himself on the base before them and slept on guard. What a scene! The master as an infant protected by the Sphinx, that ancient occult emblem and symbol, while close by, reared like mighty watchful sentinels, stood the great pyramids of Egypt, the masterwork of Egypt's mystics, every line and inch of which symbolizes an occult teaching. Verily, indeed, is Christianity cradled in the lap of mysticism. Thus endeth our first lesson. The second lesson will take up the mystic teachings regarding the divine incarnation of the Spirit in the mortal body of Jesus, a subject of the greatest importance to all who are troubled with this difficult point. We hope to be able to shed the mystic light of truth upon this corner which so many have found dark, non-understandable, and contrary to reason, natural law, and science. The mystic teachings are the great reconciler of faith and reason. Summary. This chapter explores the arrival of John the Baptist as a forerunner to Jesus, revealing the deep mystical roots behind his mission. It unveils the influence of the Essenes, a mystical brotherhood that prepared the spiritual groundwork for Jesus' mission. John's call for repentance was a symbolic preparation for a higher spiritual awakening. Key takeaways. John the Baptist was an Essene initiate, deeply schooled in mystic knowledge, preparing the way for Jesus' spiritual mission. The Essenes were an advanced mystical order that safeguarded spiritual wisdom. Jesus' connection to mystical orders allowed him to understand profound spiritual laws. Action items. Reflect on what repentance means in your spiritual journey, not as guilt, but as a conscious shift toward a higher state of being. Study the practices of the Essenes and incorporate a period of daily reflection or meditation into your routine. Identify what in your life requires purification to prepare for deeper spiritual insights. Lesson 2. The Mystery of the Virgin Birth. One of the points of conflict between established theology on the one hand and what is known as rationalism, the higher criticism, and comparative mythology, on the other hand, is what is known as the virgin birth of Jesus. Perhaps we may show the points of difference more clearly by simply stating the opposing views and, afterwards, giving the traditions of the occult brotherhoods and societies on the subject. We are enabled to state the opposing views without prejudice, because we rest upon the occult teachings with a feeling of being above and outside of the theological strife raging between the two schools of Christian theologians. We trust that the reader will reserve his decision until the consideration of the matter in this lesson is completed. We think that it will be found that the occult teachings give the key to the mystery and furnish the reconciliation between the opposing theological views which threaten to divide the churches into two camps, i.e., 1. The adherents of the established orthodox theology, and 2. The adherents of the views of the rationalists and the higher critics. The school of theology, which clings to the old orthodox teachings regarding the virgin birth, and which teachings are commonly accepted without question by the mass of church-goers, hold as follows. Mary, a young Jewish maiden or virgin, was betrothed to Joseph, a carpenter of Nazareth in Galilee. Before her marriage, she was informed by an angelic vision that she would miraculously conceive a son, to whom she would give birth, and who would reign on the throne of David, and be called the Son of the Highest. This teaching is based solely upon certain statements contained in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Matthew's account is as follows. Now, the birth of Jesus Christ was on this wise. When, as his mother Mary was espoused to Joseph, before they came together, she was found with the child of the Holy Ghost. Then Joseph, her husband, being a just man, and not willing to make her a public example, was minded to put her away privily. But while he thought on these things, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a dream, saying, Joseph, thou son of David, fear not to take unto thee Mary thy wife, for that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Ghost. And she shall bring forth a son, and thou shalt call his name Jesus, for he shall save his people from their sins. And now all this was done, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, Behold, a virgin shall be with a child, and shall bring forth a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which being interpreted is, God with us. Then Joseph, being raised from sleep, did as the angel of the Lord had bidden him, and took unto him his wife, and knew her not until she had brought forth her firstborn son, and he called his name Jesus. Matthew 1:18-25. Luke's account is as follows. And in the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent from God unto a city of Galilee, named Nazareth, to a virgin espoused to a man whose name was Joseph, of the house of David. And the virgin's name was Mary. And the angel came in unto her and said, Hail, thou that art highly favored, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women. And when she saw him, she was troubled at his saying, and cast in her mind what manner of salutation this should be. And the angel said unto her, Fear not, Mary, for thou hast found favor with God. And behold, thou shalt conceive in thy womb, and bring forth a son, and shalt call his name Jesus. He shall be great, and shall be called the Son of the Highest. And the Lord God shall give unto him the throne of his father David. And he shall reign over the house of Jacob forever. And of his kingdom there shall be no end. Then said Mary unto the angel, How shall this be, seeing I know not a man? And the angel answered and said unto her, The Holy Ghost shall come upon thee, and the power of the Highest shall overshadow thee. Therefore also that holy thing which shall be born of thee shall be called the Son of God. Luke 1:26-33. And so, this then is the commonly accepted orthodox teachings of Christian theology. It is embodied in the two best-known creeds of the Church, and is made an essential article of belief by the majority of the Orthodox churches. In the Apostles' Creed, which has been traced back to about the year AD 500, and which is claimed to have been based on an older creed, the doctrine is stated thusly, And in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was conceived by the Holy Ghost, born of the Virgin Mary, etc. In the Nicene Creed, which dates from AD 325, The doctrine is stated thusly: "And in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, begotten of his Father, and was incarnate by the Holy Ghost of the Virgin Mary," etc. And so, the doctrine is plainly stated and firmly insisted upon by the Orthodox churches of today, although such was not always the case, for the matter was one which gave rise to much conflict and difference of opinion in the early centuries of the Church, the present view, however, overcoming those who opposed it, and finally becoming accepted as beyond doubt or question by the Orthodox, believing Christian. But the present time finds many leading minds in the churches who refuse to accept the doctrine as usually taught, and the voice of the higher criticism is heard in the land in increasing volume, and many doctrines unquestioningly held by the pews are being abandoned by the pulpits, usually in the way of discreet silence being maintained. But here and there, courageous voices are heard stating plainly that which their reason and conscience impels. We shall now consider these dissenting opinions. We have to say here, at this point, that we have no sympathy for the so-called infidel opinion, which holds that the whole tale of the virgin birth was invented to conceal the illegitimate birth of Jesus. Such a view is based neither on intelligent investigation or criticism, or upon the occult teachings. It was merely invented itself by those who were unable to accept current theology, and who, when driven from the churches, built up a crude system of reconstructed biblical history of their own. And so we shall not stop to even consider this view of the matter, but shall pass on to the scholarly objectors and their views, and thence to the occult teachings. In the first place, the theologians who favor the views of the higher criticism object to the idea of the virgin birth upon several general grounds, among which the following are the principal ones. 1. That the story of the divine conception, that is, the conception by a woman of a child without a human father, and by means of a miraculous act on the part of deity, is one found among the traditions, legends, and beliefs of many heathen and pagan nations. Nearly all of the old Oriental religions, antedating Christianity by many centuries, contain stories of this kind concerning their gods, prophets, and great leaders. The critics hold that the story of the virgin birth and divine conception were borrowed outright from these pagan legends and incorporated into the Christian writings after the death of Christ. 2. That the idea of the virgin birth was not an original Christian doctrine, but was injected into the teachings at a date about 100 years, or nearly so, after the beginning of the Christian era. This view being corroborated by the fact that the New Testament writings themselves contain very little mention of the idea, the only mention of it being in two of the Gospels, those of St. Matthew and St. Luke, St. Mark and St. John containing no mention of the matter, which would not likely be the case had it been an accepted belief in the early days of Christianity, and no mention being made of it in the epistles, even Paul being utterly silent on the question. They claim that the virgin birth was unknown to the primitive Christians and was not heard of until its borrowing from pagan beliefs many years after. In support of their idea, as above stated, they call attention to the fact that the New Testament writings, known to biblical students as the oldest and earliest, make no mention of the idea, and that Paul ignores it completely, as well as the other writers. 3. That the Gospels of St. Matthew and St. Luke bear internal evidences of the introduction of the story at a later date. This matter we shall now consider from the point of view of the higher criticism within the body of the Church. In the first place, let us consider the Gospel of St. Matthew. The majority of people accept this as having been written by St. Matthew with his own hand during his ministry, and that the Gospel, word for word, is the work of this great apostle. This idea, however, is not held for a moment by the educated clergy, as may be seen by a reference to any prominent theological work of late years, or even in the pages of a good encyclopedia. The investigators have made diligent researches concerning the probable authorship of the New Testament books, and their reports would surprise many faithful churchgoers who are not acquainted with the facts of the case. There is no warrant, outside of tradition and custom, for the belief that Matthew wrote the Gospel accredited to him, at least in its present shape. Without going deeply into the argument of the investigators, which may be found in any recent work on the history of the Gospels, we would say that the generally accepted conclusion now held by the authorities is that the Gospel commonly accredited to St. Matthew is the work of some unknown hand or hands, which was produced during the latter part of the 1st century A.D., written in Greek, and most likely an enlargement or elaboration of certain Aramaic writings entitled Sayings of Jesus, which are thought to have been written by Matthew himself. In other words, even the most conservative of the critics do not claim that the Gospel of St. Matthew is anything more than an enlargement, elaboration, or development of Matthew's earlier writings, written many years before the elaboration of the present Gospel. The more radical critics take an even less respectful view. This being the fact, it may be readily seen how easy it would have been for the latter-day elaborator to introduce the then-current legend of the virgin birth, borrowed from pagan sources. As a further internal evidence of such interpolation of outside matter, the critics point to the fact that while the Gospel of Matthew is made to claim that Joseph was merely the reputed father of the child of Mary, the same Gospel, in its very first chapter, Matthew 1, gives the genealogy of Jesus from David to Joseph, the husband of Mary, in order to prove that Jesus came from the house of David, in accordance with the Messianic tradition. The chapter begins with the words, "The book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham," Matthew 1, and then goes on to name 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 generations from David to the days of the carrying away into Babylon, and 14 generations from the Babylonian days until the birth of Jesus. The critics call attention to this recital of Jesus' descent, through Joseph, from the house of David, which is but one of the many indications that the original Matthew inclined quite strongly to the view that Jesus was the Hebrew Messiah, come to reign upon the throne of David, rather than a divine avatar or incarnation. The critics point to the fact that if Joseph were not the real father of Jesus, where would be the sense and purpose of proving his descent from David through Joseph? It is pertinently asked, why the necessity or purpose of the recital of Joseph's genealogy as applied to Jesus, if indeed Jesus were not truly the son of Joseph? The explanation of the critics is that the earlier writings of Matthew contained nothing regarding the virgin birth, Matthew having heard nothing of this pagan legend, and that naturally he gave the genealogy of Jesus from David and Abraham. If one omits the verses 18 to 25 from Matthew's Gospel, he will see the logical relation of the genealogy to the rest of the account. Otherwise it is paradoxical, contradictory, and ridiculous, and shows the joints and seams where it has been fitted into the older account. But, you may ask, what of the messianic prophecy mentioned by Matthew 1:23? Surely this is a direct reference to the prophecy of Isaiah 7:14. Let us examine this so-called prophecy, of which so much has been said, and see just what reference it has to the birth of Jesus. Turning back to Isaiah 7, we find these words just a little before the prophecy. Moreover, the Lord spake again unto Ahaz, saying, Ask thee a sign of the Lord thy God. Ask it either in the depth or in the height above. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, neither will I tempt the Lord. And he said, Hear ye now, O house of David. Is it a small thing for you to weary men? But will ye weary my God also? Isaiah 6:13. Then comes the prophecy. Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. This is the prophecy quoted by the writer of the Gospel of Matthew, and which has been quoted for centuries in Christian churches as a foretelling of the miraculous birth of Jesus. As a matter of fact, intelligent theologians know that it has no reference to Jesus at all, in any way, but belongs to another occurrence, as we shall see presently, and was injected into the Gospel narrative merely to support the views of the writer thereof. It may be well to add here that many of the best authorities hold that the Greek translation of the Hebrew word alma into the equivalent of virgin in the usual sense of the word is incorrect. The Hebrew word alma, used in the original Hebrew text of Isaiah, does not mean virgin, as the term is usually employed, but rather a young woman of marriageable age, a maiden, the Hebrews having an entirely different word for the idea of virginity, as the term is generally used. The word alma is used in other parts of the Old Testament to indicate a young woman, a maiden, notably in Proverbs 30:19, in the reference to the way of a man with a maid. But we need not enter into discussions of this kind, say the higher critics, for the so-called prophecy refers to an entirely different matter. It appears, say they, that Ahaz, a weakling king of Judea, was in sore distress because Rezin the Syrian king and Pekah the ruler of northern Israel had formed an offensive alliance against him and were moving their combined forces toward Jerusalem. In his fear he sought an alliance with Assyria, which alliance was disapproved of by Isaiah, who remonstrated with Ahaz about the proposed move. The king was too much unnerved by fear to listen to Isaiah's arguments, and so the latter dropped into prophecy. He prophesied, after the manner of the Oriental seer, that the land would be laid waste and misery entailed upon Israel, should the suicidal policy be adopted. But he held out a hope for a brighter future, after the clouds of adversity had rolled by. A new and wise prince would arise who would bring Israel to her former glory. That prince would be born of a young mother, and his name would be Emmanuel, which means God with us. All this had reference to things of a reasonably near future, and had no reference to the birth of Jesus some 700 years after, who was not a prince sitting upon the throne of Israel, and who did not bring national glory and renown to Israel, for such was not his mission. Hebrew scholars and churchmen have often claimed that Isaiah's prophecy was fulfilled by the birth of Hezekiah. There is no evidence whatever in the Jewish history of the 700 years between Isaiah and Jesus that the Hebrews regarded Isaiah's prophecy as relating to the expected Messiah, but on the contrary, it was thought to relate to a minor event in their history. As a Jewish writer has truly said, throughout the wide extent of Jewish literature, there is not a single passage which can bear the construction that the Messiah should be miraculously conceived. Other writers along this line have stated the same thing, showing that the idea of a virgin birth was foreign to the Jewish mind, the Hebrews having always respected and highly honored married life and human parentage, regarding their children as blessings and gifts from God. Another writer in the church has said, "Such a fable as the birth of the Messiah from a virgin could have arisen anywhere else easier than among the Jews. Their doctrine of the divine unity placed an impassable gulf between God and the world. Their high regard for the marriage relation, etc., would have rendered the idea obnoxious. Other authorities agree with this idea and insist that the idea of the virgin birth never originated in Hebrew prophecy, but was injected into the Christian doctrine from pagan sources toward the end of the 1st century, and received credence owing to the influx of converts from the heathen peoples who found in the idea a correspondence with their former beliefs. As Reverend R.J. Campbell, minister of the City Temple, London, says in his New Theology, "No New Testament passage whatever is directly or indirectly a prophecy of the virgin birth of Jesus. To insist upon this may seem to many like beating a man of straw, but if so, the man of straw still retains a good deal of vitality. Let us now turn to the second account of the virgin birth, in the Gospels, the only other place that it is mentioned, outside of the story in Matthew, above considered. We find this second mention in Luke 1:26-35, the verses having been quoted in the first part of this lesson. There has been much dispute regarding the real authorship of the Gospel commonly accredited to Luke, but it is generally agreed upon by biblical scholars that it was the latest of the first three Gospels, generally known as the Synoptic Gospels. It is also generally agreed upon by such scholars that the author, whoever he may have been, was not an eyewitness of the events in the life of Christ. Some of the best authorities hold that he was a Gentile, non-Hebrew, probably a Greek, for his Greek literary style is far above the average, his vocabulary being very rich, and his diction admirable. It is also generally believed that the same hand wrote the book of Acts. Tradition holds that the author was one Luke, a Christian convert after the death of Jesus, who was one of Paul's missionary band which traveled from Troas to Macedonia, and who shared Paul's imprisonment in Caesarea, and who shared Paul's shipwreck experiences on the voyage to Rome. He is thought to have written his gospel long after the death of Paul, for the benefit and instruction of one Theophilus, a man of rank residing in Antioch. It is held by writers of the higher criticism that the account of the virgin birth was either injected in Luke's narrative by some later writer, or else that Luke in his old age adopted this view, which was beginning to gain credence among the converted Christians of pagan origin, Luke himself being of this class. It is pointed out that as Paul, who was Luke's close friend and teacher, made no mention of the virgin birth and taught nothing of the kind, Luke must have acquired the legend later, if, indeed, the narrative was written by him at all in his Gospel. It is likewise noted that Luke also gives a genealogy of Jesus, from Adam through Abraham and David and Joseph. The words in parenthesis, as was supposed, in Luke 3:23, are supposed to have been inserted in the text by a later writer, as there would be no sense or reason in tracing the genealogy of Jesus through a supposed father. The verse in question reads thusly, "And Jesus himself began to be about 30 years of age, being, as was supposed, the son of Joseph, which was the son of Heli," etc. Students, of course, notice that the line of descent given by Luke differs very materially from that given by Matthew, showing a lack of knowledge on the part of one or the other writer. On the whole, scholars consider it most remarkable that this account of the virgin birth should be given by Luke, who was a most ardent Pauline student and follower, in view of the fact that Paul ignored the whole legend, if, indeed, he had ever heard of it. Surely a man like Paul would have laid great stress upon this wonderful event had he believed in it, or had it formed a part of the Christian doctrine of his time. That Luke should have written this account is a great mystery, and many feel that it is much easier to accept the theory of the later interpolation of the story into Luke's Gospel, particularly in view of the corroborative indications. Summing up the views of the higher criticism, we may say that the general position taken by the opponents and deniers of the virgin birth of Jesus is about as follows. 1. The story of the virgin birth is found only in the introductory portion of 2 of the 4 Gospels, Matthew and Luke, and even in these the story bears the appearance of having been fitted in by later writers. 2. Even Matthew and Luke are silent about the matter after the statements in the introductory part of their Gospels, which could scarcely occur had the story been written by and believed in by the writers, such action on their part being contrary to human custom and probability. 3. The Gospels of Mark and John are absolutely silent on the subject. The oldest of the Gospels, that of Mark, bears no trace of the legend, and the latest Gospel, that of John, being equally free from its mention. 4. The rest of the New Testament breathes not a word of the story or doctrine. The book of Acts, generally accepted as having also been written by Luke, ignores the subject completely. Paul, the teacher of Luke, and the great writer of the early church, seems to know nothing whatever about the virgin birth, or else purposely ignores it entirely, the latter being unbelievable in such a man. Peter, the first apostle, makes no mention of the story or doctrine in his great epistles, which fact is inconceivable if he knew of and believed in the legend. The book of Revelation is likewise silent upon this doctrine, which played so important a part in the later history of the Church. The great writings of the New Testament contain no mention of the story, outside of the brief mention in Matthew and Luke alluded to above. 5. There are many verses in the Gospels and epistles which go to prove either that the story was unknown to the writers or else not accepted by them. The genealogies of Joseph are cited to prove the descent of Jesus from David, which depends entirely upon the fact of Joseph's actual parentage. Jesus is repeatedly and freely mentioned as the son of Joseph. Paul and the other apostles hold firmly to the doctrine of the necessity of the death of Jesus, his rising from the dead, and his ascension into heaven, etc. But they had nothing to say regarding any necessity for his virgin birth, or the necessity for the acceptance of any such doctrine. They are absolutely silent on this point, although they were careful men, omitting no important detail of doctrine. Paul even speaks of Jesus as of the seed of David. Rome, 6. The virgin birth was not a part of the early traditions or doctrine of the Church, but was unknown to it, and it is not referred to in the preaching and teaching of the apostles, as may have been seen by reference to the book of Acts. This book, which relates the acts and teachings of the apostles, could not have inadvertently omitted such an important doctrine or point of teaching. It is urged by careful and conscientious Christian scholars that the multitudes converted to Christianity in the early days must have been ignorant of, or uninformed on, this miraculous event, which would seem inexcusable on the part of the apostles had they known of it and believed in its truth. This condition of affairs must have lasted until nearly the 2nd century, when the pagan beliefs began to filter in by reason of the great influx of pagan converts. 7. There is every reason for believing that the legend arose from other pagan legends, the religions of other peoples being filled with accounts of miraculous births of heroes, gods, and prophets, kings, and sages. 8. That acceptance of the legend is not, nor should it be, a proof of belief in Christ and Christianity. This view is well voiced by Reverend Dr. Campbell in his New Theology, when he says, "The credibility and significance of Christianity are in no way affected by the doctrine of the virgin birth, otherwise than that the belief tends to put a barrier between Jesus and the race, and to make him something that cannot properly be called human." Like many others, I used to take the position that acceptance or non-acceptance of the doctrine of the virgin birth was immaterial because Christianity was quite independent of it. But later reflection has convinced me that in point of fact, it operates as a hindrance to spiritual religion and a real living faith in Jesus. The simple and natural conclusion is that Jesus was the child of Joseph and Mary, and had an uneventful childhood. The German theologian Soltau says, "Whoever makes the further demand that an evangelical Christian shall believe in the words conceived by the Holy Ghost, born of the Virgin Mary, wittingly constitutes himself a sharer in a sin against the Holy Spirit and the true gospel as transmitted to us by the apostles and their school in the apostolic age." And this, then, is the summing up of the contention between the conservative school of Christian theologians on the one side and the liberal and radical schools on the other side. We have given you a statement of the positions merely that you may understand the problem. But, before we pass to the consideration of the occult teachings, let us ask one question. How do the higher critics account for the undoubted doctrine of the divine fatherhood, as clearly stated all through the New Testament, in view of the proofs against the virgin birth? Why the frequent and repeated mention of Jesus as the Son of God? What was the secret doctrine underlying the divine parentage of Jesus, which the pagan legends corrupted into the story of the virgin birth of theology? We fear that the answer is not to be found in the books and preachments of the higher criticism, nor yet in those of the conservative theologians. Let us now see what light the occult teachings can throw on this dark subject. There is an inner doctrine which explains the mystery. Now, in the first place, there is no reference in the occult teaching to any miraculous features connected with the physical birth of Jesus. It is not expressly denied, it is true, but the teachings contain no reference to the matter, and all the references to the subject of Jesus' parentage speak of Joseph as being his father, and Mary his mother. In other words, the family is treated as being composed of father, mother, and child, just as is the case with any family. The occult teachings go into great detail concerning the spiritual sonship of Jesus, as we shall see presently, but there is no mention of any miraculous physical conception and birth. We can readily understand why the virgin birth legend would not appeal to the occultists, if we will but consider the doctrines of the latter. The occultists pay but little attention to the physical body, except as a temple of the spirit and a habitation of the soul. The physical body, to the occultist, is a mere material shell, constantly changing its constituent cells, serving to house the soul of the individual, and which, when cast off and discarded, is no more than any other bit of disintegrating material. They know of the existence of the soul separate from the body, both after the death of the latter and even during its life, in the case of astral travel, etc. And in many other ways it becomes natural for the occultist to regard his body, and the bodies of others, as mere shells, to be treated well, used properly, and then willingly discarded or exchanged for another. In view of the above facts, you may readily see that any theory or doctrine which made the absolute, God, overshadow a human woman's body and cause her to physically conceive a child would appear crude, barbarous, unnecessary, and in defiance of the natural laws established by the cause of causes. The occultist sees in the conception of every child the work of the divine will, every conception and birth a miracle. But he sees natural law underlying each, and he believes that the divine will always operates under natural laws, the seeming miracles and exceptions thereto, resulting from the mastery and operation of some law not generally known. But the occultist knows of no law that will operate to produce conception by other than the physiological process. In short, the occultist does not regard the physical body of Jesus as Jesus himself. He knows that the real Jesus is something much greater than his body, and, consequently, he sees no more necessity for a miraculous conception of his body than he would for a miraculous creation of his robe. The body of Jesus was only material substance. The real Jesus was spirit. The occultists do not regard Joseph as the father of the real Jesus. No human being can produce or create a soul. And so, the occultist sees no reason for accepting the old pagan doctrine of the physical virgin birth, which has crept into Christianity from outside sources. To the occultist, there is a real virgin birth of an entirely different nature, as we shall see presently. But not so with the people who flocked to the ranks of Christianity toward the close of the 1st century, coming from pagan people and bringing with them their pagan legends and doctrines. These people believed that the body was the real man, and consequently attached the greatest importance to it. These people were almost materialists as the result of their pagan views of life. They began to exert an influence on the small body of original Christians, and soon the original teachings were smothered by the weight of the pagan doctrines. For instance, They failed to grasp the beautiful ideas of immortality held by the original Christians, which held that the soul survived the death and disintegration of the body. They could not grasp this transcendental truth. They did not know what was meant by the term the soul, and so they substituted their pagan doctrine of the resurrection of the physical body. They believed that at some future time there would come a great day in which the dead would arise from their graves and become again alive. The crudeness of this idea, when compared to the beautiful doctrine of the immortality of the soul of the original Christians, and by the advanced Christians today, is quite painful. And yet these pagan converts actually smothered out the true teachings by their crude doctrine of resurrection of the body. These people could not understand how a man could live without his physical body, and to them future life meant a resurrection of their dead bodies, which would again become alive. To them, the dead bodies would remain dead until the great day when they would be made alive again. There is no teaching among these people regarding the soul which passes out of the body and lives again on higher planes. No, nothing of this kind was known to these people. They were incapable of such high ideas and ideals. They were materialists and were wedded to their beloved animal bodies, and believed that their dead bodies would in some miraculous way be made alive again at some time in the future, when they would again live on earth. In view of modern knowledge regarding the nature of matter, and the fact that what is one person's body today may be a part of another's tomorrow, that matter is constantly being converted and reconverted, that the universal material is used to form bodies of animals, plants, men, or else dwell in chemical gases, or combinations in inorganic things. In view of these accepted truths, the resurrection of the body seems a pitiful invention of the minds of a primitive and ignorant people, and not a high spiritual teaching. In fact, there may be many of you who would doubt that the Christians of that day so taught, were it not for the undisputed historical records, and the remnant of the doctrine itself embalmed in the Apostles' Creed, in the passage, "I believe in the resurrection of the body," which is read in the churches daily, but which doctrine is scarcely ever taught in these days, and is believed in by but few Christians, in fact, is ignored or even denied by the majority. Dr. James Beattie has written, "Though mankind have at all times had a persuasion of the immortality of the soul, the resurrection of the body was a doctrine peculiar to early Christianity." S.T. Coleridge has written, "Some of the most influential of the early Christian writers were materialists, holding the soul to be material, corporeal. It appears that in those days some few held the soul to be incorporeal, according to the views of Plato and others, but that the orthodox Christian divines looked upon this as an impious, unscriptural opinion. Justin Martyr argued against the Platonic nature of the soul, and even some latter-day writers have not hesitated to express their views on the subject, agreeing with the earlier Orthodox brethren. For instance, Dr. R.S. Candlish has said, "You live again in the body, in the very body, as to all essential properties, and to all practical intents and purposes, in which you live now. I am not to live as a ghost, a spectre, a spirit. I am to live then as I live now, in the body." The reason that the early church laid so much stress on this doctrine of the resurrection of the body was because an inner sect, the Gnostics, held to the contrary, and the partisan spirit of the majority swung them to the other extreme, until they utterly denied any other idea, and insisted upon the resurrection and revitalizing of the physical body. But, in spite of the official fostering of this crude theory, it gradually sank into actual insignificance, although its shadow still persists in creed and word. Its spirit has retreated and passed away before the advancing idea of the immortality of the soul, which returned again and again to Christianity until it won the victory. And as Professor Nathaniel Schmidt has said, in his article on the subject in a leading encyclopedia, The doctrine of the natural immortality of the human soul became so important a part of Christian thought that the resurrection naturally lost its vital significance, and it has practically held no place in the great systems of philosophy elaborated by the Christian thinkers in modern times. And yet, the Church continues to repeat the now meaningless words, "I believe in the resurrection of the body." And while practically no one now believes it, still the recital of the words and the statement of one's belief in them forms a necessary requisite for admission into the Christian Church today. Such is the persistent hold of dead forms and thoughts upon living people. And so you can readily see from what has been said why the early Christians, about the close of the 1st century AD, attached so much importance to the physical conception and birth of Jesus. To them, the physical body of Jesus was Jesus himself. The rest follows naturally, including the virgin birth and the physical resurrection. We trust that you now understand this part of the subject. We have heard devout Christians shocked at the idea that Jesus was born of a human father and mother, in the natural way of the race. They seem to think that it savored of impurity. Such a notion is the result of a perverted idea of the sacredness of natural functions, a seeing of impurity, where all is pure. What a perversion! This regarding the sacredness of human fatherhood and motherhood as impure. The man of true spirituality sees in the divine trinity of Father, Mother, and Child something most pure and sacred, something that brings man very close indeed to God. Is the beautiful babe, held close in its mother's fond embrace, a symbol and type of impurity? Is the watchful care and love of the father of the babe an impure result of an impure cause? Does not one's own heart tell him the contrary? Look at the well-known picture of the journey to Egypt, with Mary carrying the babe, and both guarded and protected by the husband and father, Joseph. Is this not a beautiful symbol of the sacredness of parenthood? We trust that the majority of those who read these pages have advanced spiritually beyond the point where the family is a thing of impure suggestion and relationship. And now, what are the occult teachings, the secret doctrine, regarding the real virgin birth of Jesus? Just this, that the Spirit of Jesus was fresh from the bosom of the Absolute, Spirit of Spirit, a virgin birth of Spirit. His Spirit had not traveled the weary upward path of reincarnation and repeated rebirth, but was virgin Spirit fresh from the Spirit, a very Son of the Father, begotten, not created. This virgin Spirit was incarnated in his body, and there began the life of man, not fully aware of his own nature, but gradually awakening into knowledge just as does every human soul, until at last the true nature of his being burst upon him, and he saw that he indeed was God incarnate. In his short life of 33 years, 30 years of preparation, and 3 years of ministry, Jesus typified and symbolized the life of the race. Just as he awakened into a perception of his divine nature, so shall the race awaken in time. Every act in the life of Jesus typified and symbolized the life of every individual soul, and of the race. We all have our Garden of Gethsemane. Each is crucified and ascends to higher planes. This is the occult doctrine of the virgin birth of Christ. Is it not a worthy one? Is it not at least a higher conception of the human mind than the physical virgin birth legend? As we proceed with our lessons, we shall bring out the details of the occult teachings concerning the divine nature of Christ, the Spirit within the human form. And, in these references and instruction, you will see even more clearly that nature of the spiritual virgin birth of Jesus. The original Christians were instructed in the truth concerning the virgin birth, that is, those who were sufficiently intelligent to grasp it. But after the great teachers passed away, and their successors became overzealous in their desire to convert the outside peoples. The influx of the latter gradually overcame the original teachings, and the physical virgin birth and the resurrection of the body became doctrines and articles of faith, held of vital importance by the new Orthodox leaders. It has taken centuries of mental struggle and spiritual unfoldment to bring the light of the truth to bear upon this dark corner of the faith. But the work is now fairly underway, and the great minds in the Church, as well as those out of the Church, are beginning to lay the old legend aside as a worn-out relic of primitive days when the cloud of ignorance overshadowed the light of truth. In concluding this lesson, let us glance once more at the words of the eminent divine Dr. Campbell in his New Theology, in which he states, "But why hesitate about the question? The greatness of Jesus and the value of his revelation to mankind are in no way either assisted or diminished by the manner of his entry into the world. Every birth is just as wonderful as a virgin birth could possibly be, and just as much a direct act of God. A supernatural conception bears no relation whatever to the moral and spiritual worth of the person who is supposed to enter the world in this abnormal way. Those who insist on the doctrine will find themselves in danger of proving too much, for pressed to its logical conclusion, it removes Jesus altogether from the category of humanity in any real sense. Let us trust that these higher critics may become informed upon the truths of the occult teachings, which supply the missing key and afford the reconciliation, and which show how and why Jesus is, in all and very truth, the Son of God, begotten and not created, of one substance from the Father, a particle of purest spirit fresh from the ocean of spirit and free from the karma of past incarnations, how he was human, and yet more than human." In our next lesson, we shall take up the narrative of the secret life of Jesus from the time of his appearance, as a child at the temple, among the elders, until when, at the age of 30 years, he appeared at the scene of the ministry of John the Baptist, and began his own brief ministry of 3 years, which was closed by the crucifixion and ascension. This is a phase of the subject of intense interest and startling nature because of the lack of knowledge of the occult traditions on the part of the general public. Summary. This lesson reveals that the virgin birth symbolizes the emergence of a pure spiritual consciousness directly from the divine source. Jesus' physical birth followed natural law, but his inner essence was a divine emanation, untouched by the karmic cycles of reincarnation. Key takeaways. The virgin birth is a symbol of pure divine consciousness awakening in humanity. Jesus' mission was to reveal that the Christ presence is latent within every soul. The spiritual path is about awakening this virgin consciousness, your true divine nature. Action items. Embrace practices that purify your mind: prayer, meditation, or mindful contemplation. Reflect on what aspects of your life need to be reborn from a place of spiritual innocence. Spend a few minutes each day affirming, "The Christ consciousness is awakening within me." Lesson 3. The Mystic Youth of Jesus. In our last lesson, we promised to tell you the esoteric story of the youth of Jesus. And there is such a story to tell, although the churches know little or nothing about it. The churches have nothing but the husks that have always been the property of the masses. The real kernels of truth have been possessed by but the few elect ones. The legends of the mystic brotherhoods and occult orders have preserved the story intact, and you shall now be given the essence of the mystic legends and traditions. At the end of our first lesson, we left Joseph, Mary, and the infant Jesus in Egypt, the land to which they had flown to escape the wrath of the tyrant Herod. They dwelt in Egypt for a few years, until the death of Herod. Then Joseph retraced his steps and returned toward his own country, bringing with him his wife and the babe. For some reasons unknown to those familiar with the legends and traditions, Joseph decided not to locate in Judea, but instead bent his way toward the coast and returned to Nazareth, where Mary and he had originally met and become betrothed. And so in Nazareth, the humble little mountain town, the boyhood days of Jesus were spent, the grinding poverty of the family being relieved, according to the occult legends, by the yearly presents of gold from the hands of disguised messengers of the Magi. The traditions relate that Jesus began his study of the Hebrew law when he was but 5 years of age. It is related that he displayed an unusual ability and talent in the direction of mastering not only the text, but also the spirit of the Hebrew Scripture, and far outstripped his fellow students. It is also related that he displayed an early impatience at the dreary formalism of his Hebrew teachers, and a disposition to go right to the heart of the text before him, that he might discern the spirit animating it. So much was this the case that he frequently brought down upon his head the censure of his instructors who overlooked the spirit of the teachings in their devotion to the forms and words. Nazareth was an old-fashioned place, and it and its inhabitants were made the target for the jests and witticisms of the people of Judea. The word Nazarene was synonymous with lout, boor, peasant, etc., to the residents of the more fashionable regions. The very remoteness of the town served to separate it in spirit from the rest of the country. But this very remoteness played an important part in the early life of Jesus. Nazareth, by reason of its peculiar location, was on the line of several caravan routes. Travelers from many lands traveled through the town and rested there overnight, or sometimes for several days. Travelers from Samaria, Jerusalem, Damascus, Greece, Rome, Arabia, Syria, Persia, Phoenicia, and other lands mingled with the Nazarenes, and the traditions relate that Jesus, the child, would steal away and talk with such of these travelers as were versed in occult and mystic lore, and would imbibe from their varied founts of learning, until he was as thoroughly informed on these subjects as many a mystic of middle age. The traditions have it that the boy would often delight and astonish these traveling occultists with his wonderful insight into their secret doctrines and knowledge. And it is also told that some of the wisest of these, seeing the nature of the child, would overstay their allotted time of sojourn, that they might add here and there to the various parts of general occult lore possessed by the child. It is also taught that the Magi informed some of these travelers regarding the boy, that they might impart to him some truth or teaching for which he was ready. And so the boy grew in knowledge and wisdom, day by day, year by year, until, finally, there occurred an event in his life, which has since been the subject of greatest interest to all Christians and students of the New Testament, but which, without the above explanation, is not readily understood. The feast of the Passover occurred in its allotted time of the year, April, when Jesus was in his 13th year. This feast was one of the most important in the Jewish calendar, and its observance was held as a most sacred duty by all Hebrews. It was the feast set down for the remembrance and perpetuation of that most important event in the history of the Jewish people, when the angel of death swept over all of Egypt's land, smiting the firstborn child of every house of the natives, high and low, but sparing all the houses of the captive Hebrews, who marked their door-sills with the sacrificial blood as a token of their faith. This is no place to give the explanation of this apparently miraculous event, which students now know to be due to natural causes. We merely mention it in passing. The lawgivers of Israel had appointed the feast of the Passover as a perpetual symbol of this event so important by the nation, and every self-respecting Jew felt obligated to take part in the observance and sacrament. Every pious Jew made it a point to perform a pilgrimage to Jerusalem at the time of the feast of the Passover, if he could in any way manage to do so. At the time of the Passover celebration of which we are speaking, Jesus had just entered into his 13th year, which age entitled him, under the ecclesiastical law, to the privilege of sitting with the adult men of his race at the Passover supper, and also to publicly join with the male congregation in the Thanksgiving service in the synagogues. And so, on this year, he accompanied his father and mother to Jerusalem and made his second visit to the Holy City. It will be remembered that his first visit there was made when, as an infant, he was carried thither from Bethlehem in his mother's arms in accordance with the Jewish law, and at which time an aged priest and an old prophetess had publicly acknowledged the divine nature of the child. The Father, Mother, and Child, the divine trinity of human relationship, traveled slowly over the highway that led from Nazareth to Jerusalem. The father and mother were concerned with the details of the journey, mingled with pious thoughts concerning the sacred feast in which they were to take part. But the boy's mind was far away from the things that were occupying his parents' thoughts. He was thinking over the deep mystic truths which he had so readily absorbed during the past few years, and he was looking forward in delightful anticipation to his expected meeting with the older mystics in the temples and public places of Jerusalem. It must be remembered that underlying the Jewish ecclesiastical teachings and formalism, which were all that the mass of the people knew, there was a great store of Jewish occultism and mysticism known to the few elect. The Kabbalah, or Jewish occult writings, were closely studied by the learned Jews, and this work with other similar teachings were transmitted verbally from teacher to student, and constituted the secret doctrine of the Hebrew religion. And it was toward the learned teachers of this secret doctrine that Jesus directed his mind and steps, although his parents knew it not. 4 or 5 days were consumed in the journey, and at last the holy city, Jerusalem, came into full view, the wonderful temple of Israel showing plainly above the other buildings. The bands of pilgrims, of which the family of Joseph formed a part, formed into orderly array, and led by flute players they solemnly marched into the streets of the holy city, singing and chanting the sacred songs used by the faithful upon this solemn occasion. And the boy walked with the rest, with bowed head, and eyes that seemed to see things far removed from the scene around them. The Passover rites were carried out, the duties were performed, the ceremonies were observed. The Passover feast extended over a full week, of which the first 2 days were the most important, and during which 2 days the obligatory ceremonies were performed. Each family made the offering of the sacrificial lamb. Each family baked and ate the unleavened bread. The beautiful idea of the Passover had degenerated into a horrible feast of blood, for it is related that upon these occasions over 250,000 of poor innocent lambs were slaughtered and offered up as a sacrifice pleasing to Jehovah, who was supposed to delight in this flood of the blood of innocents. In pursuance of this barbarous idea, the altars and courts of the temple of the living God ran red with the lifeblood of these poor creatures, and the hands and garments of the anointed priests of Jehovah were stained like those of butchers, that the vanity of a barbarous conception of deity might be fed. All this for the glory of God. Think of it, and think of the feeling that must have been aroused in the mystic mind of Jesus at this horrible sight. How his soul must have been outraged at this prostitution of the sacred rite. And what would have been his thoughts had he known that centuries after, a great religion would stand, bearing his name, the followers of which would be carried away with this same false idea of sacrificial blood, which would be voiced in hymns about a fountain filled with blood flowing from Emmanuel's veins, and about sinners plunged beneath that bloody flood, losing all their guilty stains. Alas, for the prostitution of sacred truths and teachings. No wonder that a people so saturated with the abominable ideas of a deity, delighting in this flow of blood, should have afterward put to death the greatest man of their race, a being who came to bring them the highest mystic and occult truths. And their prototypes have survived through the centuries, even unto today, insisting upon this idea of blood sacrifice and death atonement, unworthy of any people except the worshippers of some heathen devil god in the remote sections of darkest Africa. Disgusted and outraged by this barbarous sight, Jesus, the boy, stole away from the side of his parents and sought the remote chambers and corridors of the temple, where were to be found the great teachers of the law and of the Kabbalah, surrounded by their students. Here the boy sat and listened to the teachings and disputations of the teachers and exponents of the doctrines. From one group to another he wandered and listened and pondered and thought. He compared the teachings and submitted the various ideas to the touchstone of the truth as he found it within his own mind. The hours rapidly passed by unnoticed by the boy, who found himself amidst such congenial environments for the first time. The talks with the travelers of the caravans paled into insignificance when compared with these of the great occult teachers of Israel. For be it remembered that it was the custom of the great teachers of that day to so instruct those who were attracted to their company. And Jerusalem being the center of the culture and learning of Israel, the great teachers dwelt there. And so it will be seen that Jesus now found himself at the very fountainhead of the Hebrew secret doctrines, and in the actual presence of the great teachers. On the third day, there began a breaking up of the vast gathering of the 2 million of people who had made the pilgrimage to the holy city. Those poorer in purse were the first to leave, after the obligatory rites of the first 2 days had been performed. And Joseph and Mary were among those preparing to retrace their steps to their distant homes. Their friends and neighbors gathered together, and the preparations for the return were completed. But at the last moment, the parents discovered that the boy, Jesus, was missing. They were alarmed, but friends told them that their boy had been seen in the company of kinsmen and neighbors traveling along the same road, who had preceded them but a few hours. Somewhat reassured, the parents left with their company, hoping that they would overtake the boy before nightfall. But when they reached the first station on the caravan route, a village called Beroth, and the night descended upon them, and the boy failed to appear among the neighbors and kinsmen, the parents were sorely distressed. They slept but little that night, and when the first rays of dawn appeared, they parted from the company and retraced their way back to Jerusalem, in search of the boy, apparently lost in the great capital, amid the hundreds of thousands of pilgrims. Every mother and father will enter into the feelings of Joseph and Mary in their frantic return to the city, and in their subsequent search for the lost child. They inquired here and there for the boy, but not a trace of him was found. And night came without a ray of hope. And the next day was likewise barren of results. And the next day after. For 3 days, the devoted parents searched high and low for their beloved child. But no word of encouragement came to them. The boy had seemingly dropped out of sight in the vast crowds and winding streets. The parents reproached themselves for their lack of care and caution. None but a parent can imagine their anguish and terror. They visited the many courts of the temple many times, but no sight or word of the boy rewarded their search. The bloody altars, the showy costumes of the priests, the chants, the readings, seemed like mockery to them. They wished themselves back in their humble village, with their boy by their side. They prayed and besought Jehovah to grant their hopes and desire, but no answer came. Then, on the last day, a strange event occurred. The weary and heartbroken parents wandered once more into the temple, this time visiting one of the less frequented courts. They saw a crowd gathered. Something of importance was occurring. Almost instinctively, they drew near to the crowd. And then, amidst the unusual silence of the people, they heard a boyish voice raised to a pitch, adapted to a large circle of hearers, and speaking in the tones of authority. It was the voice of the boy, Jesus. With eager feet, the couple pushed forward unto the very inner row of the circle. And there, wonder of wonders, they saw their child in the center of the most celebrated teachers and doctors of the law in all Israel. With a rapt expression in his eyes, as if he were gazing upon things not of this world, the boy Jesus was standing in a position and attitude of authority, and around him were grouped the greatest minds of the day and land, in respectful attention, while at a further distance stood the great circle of the common people. When one remembers the Jewish racial trait of reverence for age and the consequent submission of youth, one will better understand the unusual spectacle that burst upon the gaze of Joseph and Mary. A mere boy, a child, daring to even speak boldly in the presence of the aged teachers was unheard of, and the thought of such a one actually presuming to dispute, argue, and teach in such an assembly was like unto a miracle. And such it was. The boy spoke with the air and in the tones of a master. He met the most subtle arguments and objections of the elders with the power of the keenest intellect and spiritual insight. He brushed aside the sophistries with a contemptuous phrase and brought back the argument to the vital point. The crowd gathered in greater volume. The gray heads and beards grew more and more respectful. It was evident to all that a master had arisen in Israel in the form of a boy of 13. The master was apparent in tone, gesture, and thought. The mystic had found his first audience, and his congregation was composed of the leading thinkers and teachers of the land. The insight of the Magi was verified. Then, in a momentary pause in the argument, the stifled cry of a woman was heard, the voice of the mother. The crowd turned impatient, reproachful glances upon Mary, who had been unable to restrain her emotion. But the boy, looking sadly but affectionately at his lost parents, gave her a reassuring glance, which at the same time bade her remain still until he had finished his discourse. And the parents obeyed the newly awakened will of their child. The teaching ended. The boy stepped from his position with the air of one of the elders and rejoined his parents, who passed as rapidly as possible from the wondering crowd. Then his mother reproached him, telling him of their distress and wearisome search. The boy listened calmly and patiently until she had finished. Then he asked, with his newly acquired air of authority, "Why sought ye me?" And when they answered him in the customary manner of parents, the boy took on still a greater air of authority, and in tones that, though kindly, were full of power, he replied, "Knew ye not that I must be in my Father's house? I must be about the things of my Father." And the parents, feeling themselves in the presence of the mystery that had ever been about the child, followed him silently from the temple grounds. And here closes the New Testament story of the boy Jesus at the age of 13, which story is not resumed until his appearance at the place of the preaching of John the Baptist over 17 years later, when the boy had reached the age of a man of 30 years. When and how did he spend those 17 years? The New Testament is totally silent on this score. Can anyone who has read the above imagine that Jesus spent these years as a growing youth and young man, working at his father's carpenter bench in the village of Nazareth? Would not the Master, having found his strength and power, have insisted upon developing the same? Could the divine genius, once self-recognized, be content to be obscured amid material pursuits? The New Testament is silent, but the occult traditions and mystic legends tell us the story of the missing 17 years, and these we shall now give to you. The legends and traditions of the mystic and occult organizations and brotherhoods tell us that after the occurrence of Jesus and the elders in the temple, and his recovery by his parents, the latter were approached by members of the secret organization to which the Magi belonged, who pointed out to the parents the injustice of the plan of keeping the lad at the carpenter's bench, when he had shown evidences of such a marvelous spiritual development and such a wonderful intellectual grasp of weighty subjects. It is told that after a long and serious consideration of the matter, the parents finally consented to the plan advanced by the Magi, and allowed them to take the lad with them into their own land and retreats, that he might there receive the instructions for which his soul craved, and for which his mind was fitted. It is true that the New Testament does not corroborate these occult legends, but it is likewise true that it says nothing to the contrary. It is silent regarding this important period of between 17 and 18 years. It is to be remembered that when he appeared upon the scene of John's ministration, the latter did not recognize him, whereas had Jesus remained about his home, John, his cousin, would have been acquainted with his features and personal appearance. The occult teachings inform us that the 17 or 18 years of Jesus' life, regarding which the Gospels are silent, were filled with travels in far and distant lands, where the youth and young man was instructed in the occult lore and wisdom of the different schools. It is taught that he was taken into India and Egypt and Persia and other far regions, living for several years at each important center, and being initiated into the various brotherhoods, orders, and bodies having their headquarters there. Some of the Egyptians' orders have traditions of a young master who sojourned among them, and such is likewise the case in Persia and in India. Even among the lamasaris hidden in Tibet and in the Himalayan mountains are to be found legends and stories regarding the marvelous young master who once visited there and absorbed their wisdom and secret knowledge. More than this, there are traditions among the Brahmins, Buddhists, and Zoroastrians telling of a strange young teacher who appeared among them, who taught marvelous truths and who aroused great opposition among the priests of the various religions of India and Persia, owing to his preaching against priestcraft and formalism, and also by his bitter opposition to all forms of caste distinctions and restrictions. And this, too, is in accord with the occult legends, which teach that from about the age of 21 until the age of nearly 30 years, Jesus pursued a ministry among the people of India and Persia and neighboring countries, returning at last to his native land, where he conducted a ministry extending over the last 3 years of his life. The occult legends inform us that he aroused great interest among the people of each land visited by him, and that he also aroused the most bitter opposition among the priests, for he always opposed formalism and priestcraft, and sought to lead the people back to the spirit of the truth, and away from the ceremonies and forms which have always served to dim and becloud the light of the Spirit. He taught always the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. He sought to bring the great occult truths down to the comprehension of the masses of people who had lost the spirit of the truth in their observance of outward forms and pretentious ceremonies. It is related that in India he brought down upon his head the wrath of the Brahmin upholders of the caste distinctions, that curse of India. He dwelt in the huts of the Sudras, the lowest of all of the Hindu castes, and was therefore regarded as a pariah by the higher classes. Everywhere he was regarded as a firebrand and a disturber of established social order by the priests and high caste people. He was an agitator, a rebel, a religious renegade, a socialist, a dangerous man, an undesirable citizen to those in authority in those lands. But the seeds of his wisdom were sown right and left, and in the Hindu religions of today, and in the teachings of other Oriental countries, may be found traces of truth, the resemblance of which to the recorded teachings of Jesus show that they came from the same source, and have sorely disturbed the Christian missionaries that have since visited these lands. And so, slowly and patiently, Jesus wended his way homeward toward Israel, where he was to complete his ministry by 3 years' work among his own race, and where he was to again raise up against himself the opposition of the priests and the upper classes, which would finally result in his death. He was a rebel against the established order of things, and he met the fate reserved for those who live ahead of their time. And, as from the first days of his ministry to his last, so it is today, the real teachings of the Man of Sorrows reach more readily the heart of the plain people, while they are reviled and combated by those in ecclesiastical and temporal authority, even though these people claim allegiance to him and wear his livery. He was ever the friend of the poor and oppressed, and hated by those in authority. And so, you see, the occult teachings show Jesus to have been a worldwide teacher, instead of a mere Jewish prophet. The world was his audience, and all races his hearers. He planted his seeds of truth in the bosom of many religions instead of but one, and these seeds are beginning to bear their best fruit even now at this late day, when the truth of the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man is beginning to be felt by all nations alike, and is growing strong enough to break down the old, which have divided brother from brother, and creed from creed. Christianity, true Christianity, is not a mere creed, but a great human and divine truth that will rise above all petty distinctions of race and creed, and will at last shine on all men alike, gathering them into one fold of universal brotherhood. May the great day be hastened. And so we leave Jesus, wending his way slowly homeward toward Judea, the land of his father and the place of his birth. Dropping a word here, planting a seed there, onward he pursued his way. Visiting this mystic brotherhood and resting a while in another occult retreat, he slowly retraced the journey of his youth. But while his outward journey was that of a student traveling forth to complete his education, he returned as a master and teacher, bearing and sowing the seeds of a great truth, which was to grow and bring forth great fruit, and which, in time, would spread over all the world in its primitive purity, notwithstanding its betrayal and corruption at the hands of those in whose keeping he left it when he passed away from the scene of his labors. Jesus came as a world prophet, not as a mere Jewish holy man, and still less as a Hebrew Messiah destined to sit upon the throne of his father David. And he left his mark upon all of the great peoples of earth by his journey among them. Throughout Persia are found many traditions of Isa, the young master who appeared in that land centuries ago, and who taught the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. Among the Hindus are found strange traditions of Jesoph, or Josa, a young ascetic, who passed through the Hind long since, denouncing the established laws of caste and consorting with the common people who, as in Israel, heard him gladly. Even in China are found similar tales of the young religious firebrand, preaching ever the brotherhood of man, ever known as the friend of the poor. On and on he went, sowing the seeds of human freedom and the casting off of the yoke of ecclesiastical tyranny and formalism, which seeds are springing unto growth even at this late day. Yea, the spirit of his real teachings are even now bearing fruit in the hearts of men, and though nearly 2,000 years have passed by, the soul of his social teachings still goes marching on, round and round the world. Summary. Jesus' missing years are explained as a period of intensive spiritual study. Traditions reveal that Jesus journeyed through Egypt, Persia, and India, where he was initiated into mystical wisdom and honed his ability to channel divine power. Key takeaways. Jesus underwent intense mystical training, mastering sacred knowledge from multiple traditions. His teachings combine wisdom from the East and West, uniting mystical insight with practical spirituality. Spiritual growth often requires periods of retreat, study, and silence. Action items. Set aside time for focused spiritual study. Choose a text or teaching that resonates with your soul. Explore meditation techniques to expand your consciousness. Reflect on Jesus' journey as a reminder that spiritual mastery requires dedication and inner work. Lesson 4. The beginning of the ministry. When Jesus reached his native land, after the years of travel in India, Persia, and Egypt, he is believed by the occultists to have spent at least 1 year among the various lodges and retreats of the Essenes. By reference to the first lesson of this series, you will see who and what was this great mystic organization, the Essenic Brotherhood. While resting and studying in their retreats, his attention was diverted to the work of Johanan, John the Baptist, and he saw there an opening wedge for the great work that he felt called upon to do among his own people. Dreams of converting his own race, the Jews, to his conception of truth and life crept over him, and he determined to make this work his great life task. The feeling of race is hard to overcome and eradicate, and Jesus felt that, after all, here he was at last, at home, among his own people, and the ties of blood and race reasserted themselves. He put aside his previous thoughts of a world-wandering life and decided to plant the standard of the truth in Israel, so that from the capital of the chosen people, the light of the Spirit might shine forth to all the world. It was Jesus the man, Jesus the Jew, that made this choice. From the broader, higher point of view, he had no race, no country, no people, but his man nature was too strong, and in yielding to it, he sowed the seeds for his final undoing. Had he merely passed through Judea as a traveling missionary, as had done many others before him, he would have escaped the punishment of the government. Although he would have aroused the hatred and opposition of the priests, he would have not laid himself open to the charge of wishing to become the king of the Jews, or the Jewish Messiah, come to resume the throne of David, his forefather. But it avails us not to indulge in speculations of this kind, for who knows what part destiny or fate plays in the great universal plan? Who knows where free will terminates and destiny moves the pieces on the board, that the great game of universal life be played according to the plan? While among the Essenes, as we have said, Jesus first heard of John and determined to use the ministry of the latter as an opening wedge for his own great work. He communicated to the Essenic fathers his determination to travel to John's field of work later on, and the fathers sent word of this to John. The legends have it that John did not know who was coming, being merely informed that a great master from foreign parts would join him later on, and that he, John, should prepare the people for his coming. And John followed these instructions from his superiors in the Essenic Brotherhood to the letter, as you will see by reference to our first lesson, and to the New Testament. He preached repentance, righteousness, the Essenic rite of baptism, and above all the coming of the Master. He bade his hearers repent. Repent ye, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Repent ye, for the Master cometh, cried he in forceful tones. And when his people gathered around him and asked whether he, John, were not indeed the Master, he answered them, saying, Nay, I am not he whom thou seekest. After me there cometh one whose sandals I am not worthy to unloose. I baptize thee with water, but he shall baptize thee with the fire of the Spirit that is within him. It was ever and always this exhortation toward fitness for the coming of the Master. John was a true mystic, who sank his personality in the work he was called on to do, and who was proud to be but the forerunner of the Master, of whose coming he had been informed by the Brotherhood. And, as we have told you in the first lesson, one day there came before him a young man of a dignified, calm appearance, gazing upon him with the expressive eyes of the true mystic. The stranger asked to be baptized, but John, having perceived the occult rank of the stranger by means of the signs and symbols of the Brotherhood, rebelled at the Master receiving baptism at the hands of himself, one far below the occult rank of the stranger. But Jesus, the stranger, said to John, "Suffer it to be," and stepped into the water to receive the mystic rite again, as a token to the people that he had come as one of them. And then occurred that strange event, with which you are familiar, when a dove descended as if from heaven and rested over the head of the stranger, and a soft voice, even as the sighing of the wind through the trees, was heard, whispering, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." And then the stranger, evidently awed by the strange message from the beyond, passed away from the multitude and bent his way toward the wilderness, as if in need of a retreat in which he could meditate over the events of the day, and regarding the work which he could now dimly see stretching its way before him. The average student of the New Testament passes over the event of Jesus in the wilderness with little or no emotion, regarding it as a mere incident in his early career. Not so with the mystic or occultist, who knows, from the teachings of his order, that in the wilderness Jesus was subjected to a severe occult test, designed to develop his power and test his endurance. In fact, as every advanced member of any of the great occult orders knows, the occult degree known as the Ordeal of the Wilderness is based upon this mystic experience of Jesus, and is intended to symbolize the tests to which he was subjected. Let us consider this event so fraught with meaning and importance to all true occultists. The wilderness toward which Jesus diverted his steps lay afar off from the river in which the rites of baptism had been performed. Leaving behind him the fertile banks and acres of cultivated land, he approached the terrible wilderness which even the natives of that part of the country regarded with superstitious horror. It was one of the weirdest and dreariest spots in even that weird and dreary portion of the country. The Jews called it the abode of horror, the desolate place of terror, the appalling region, and other names suggestive of the superstitious dread which it inspired in their hearts. The mystery of the desert places hung heavy over this place, and none but the stoutest hearts ventured within its precincts. Though akin to the desert, the place abounded in dreary and forbidding hills, crags, ridges, and canyons. Those of our readers who have ever traveled across the American continent and have seen some of the desolate places of the American desert, and who have read of the terrors of Death Valley or the Alkali Lands, may form an idea of the nature of this wilderness toward which the Master was traveling. All normal vegetation gradually disappeared as he pressed further and further into this terrible place, until naught remained but the scraggy vegetation peculiar to these waste places, those forms of plant life that in their struggle for existence had managed to survive under such adverse conditions as to give the naturalist the impression that the very laws of natural plant life have been defied and overcome. Little by little, the teeming animal life of the lower lands disappeared, until at last no signs of such life remained, other than the soaring vultures overhead and the occasional serpent and crawling things underfoot. The silence of the waste places was upon the traveler, brooding heavily over him and all around the places upon which he set his foot, descending more heavily upon him each moment of his advance. Then came a momentary break in the frightful scene. He passed through the last inhabited spot in the approach to the heart of the wilderness, the tiny village of Engedi, where were located the ancient limestone reservoirs of water which supplied the lower regions of the territory. The few inhabitants of this remote outpost of primitive civilization gazed in wonder and awe at the lonely figure passing them with unseeing eyes, and with gaze seemingly able to pierce the forbidding hills which loomed up in the distance, hiding lonely recesses into which the foot of man had never trodden. Even the boldest of the desert people being deterred from a visit thereto by the weird tales of unholy creatures and unhallowed things, which made these places the scene of their uncanny meetings and diabolical orgies. On and on pressed the master, giving but slight heed to the desolate scene which now showed naught but gloomy hills, dark canyons, and bare rocks, relieved only by the occasional bunches of stringy desert grass and weird forms of cacti bristling with the protective spines, which is their armor against their enemies. At last, the wanderer reached the summit of one of the higher foothills and gazed at the scene spreading itself before him. And that scene was one that would have affrighted the heart of an ordinary man. Behind him was the country through which he had passed, which, though black and discouraging, was as a paradise to the country which lay ahead of him. There below and behind him were the caves and rude dwellings of the outlaws and fugitives from justice, who had sought the doubtful advantage of security from the laws of man. And far away in the distance were the scenes of John the Baptist's ministry, where he could see in imagination the multitude discussing the advent of the strange master, who had been vouched for by the voice, but who had stolen swiftly away from the scene, and had fled the crowds who would have gladly worshipped him as a master, and have obeyed his slightest command. Then, as the darkness of the succeeding nights fell upon him, he would sleep on some wild mountain cliff, on the edge of some mighty precipice, the sides of which dropped down 1,000 feet or more. But these things disturbed him not. On and on he pressed at the appearance of each dawn. Without food, he boldly moved forward to the heart of the hills, where the Spirit guided him to the scene of some great spiritual struggle, which he intuitively knew lay before him. The words of the voice haunted him still, though he lacked a full understanding of them, for he had not yet unfolded the utmost recesses of his spiritual mind. "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." What meant these words? And still no answer came to that cry of his soul, which sought in vain for a freeing of that riddle. And still on and on he pressed, until at last he mounted the steep sides of the barren, forbidding mountain of Quarantena, beyond which he felt that his struggle was to begin. No food was to be found. He must fight the battle unaided by the material sustenance that ordinary men find necessary for life and strength. And still he had not received the answer to the cry of his soul. The rocks beneath his feet, the blue sky above his head, the lofty peaks of Moab and Gilead in the distance, gave no answer to the fierce, insistent desire for the answer to the riddle of the voice. The answer must come from within, and from himself only. And in the heart of the wilderness he must remain, without food, without shelter, without human companionship, until the answer came. And as it was with the Master, so is it with the follower. All who attain the point of unfoldment, at which the answer is alone possible, must experience that awful feeling of aloneness and spiritual hunger, and frightful remoteness from all that the world values, before the answer comes from within, from the Holy of Holies of the Spirit. To realize the nature of the spiritual struggle that awaited Jesus in the wilderness, that struggle that would bring him face to face with his own soul, we must understand the Jewish longing and expectation of the Messiah. The Messianic traditions had taken a strong hold upon the minds of the Jewish people, and it needed but the spark of a strong personality to set all Israel into a blaze which would burn fiercely and destroy the foreign influences which have smothered the national spirit. The idea of a Messiah springing from the loins of David and coming to take his rightful place as the King of the Jews was embedded in the heart of every Jew worthy of the name. Israel was oppressed by its conquerors and made subject to a foreign yoke. But when the Messiah would come to deliver Israel, every Jew would arise to drive out the foreign invaders and conquerors. The yoke of Rome would be thrown off, and Israel would once more take its place among the nations of the earth. Jesus knew full well the fact of this national hope. It had been installed into his mind from childhood. He had pondered over it often during the time of his wanderings and sojourn in foreign lands. The occult legends, however, make no mention of his having ever thought of himself as the Messiah until he was about to re-enter his own land after his years of foreign study and ministry. It is thought that the idea of his being the long-expected Messiah was first suggested by some of the Essenic teachers, when he rested with them for a while before appearing before John the Baptist. It was pointed out to him that the marvelous events surrounding his birth indicated that he was a marked individual destined to play an important part in the history of the world. Then why was it not reasonable to believe that that role was to be that of the Messiah, come to sit on the throne of his father David, and destined to bring Israel from her now obscure position to once more shine as a bright star in the firmament of nations? Why was it not reasonable that he was to lead the chosen people to their own? Jesus began to ponder over these things. He had absolutely no material ambitions for himself, and all his impulses and inclinations were for the life of an occult ascetic. But the idea of a redeemed and regenerated Israel was one calculated to fire the blood of any Jew, even though the element of personal ambition might be lacking in him. He had always realized that in some way he was different from other men, and that some great work lay ahead of him, but he had never understood his own nature, nor the work he was to do. And it is not to be wondered that the talk among the Essenes caused him to ponder carefully over the idea expressed by them. And then the wonderful event of the dove and the voice upon the occasion of his baptism seemed almost to verify the idea of the Essenes. Was he indeed the long-expected deliverer of Israel? Surely he must find this out. He must wring the answer from the inmost recesses of his soul. And so he sought refuge in the wilderness, intuitively feeling that there, amidst the solitude and desolation, he would fight his fight and receive his answer. He felt that he had come to a most important phase of his life's work, and the question of, "What am I?" must be settled, once and for all, then and there. And so he left behind him the admiring and worshipful crowds of John's following, and sought the solitude of the waste places of the wilderness, in which he felt he would come face to face with his own soul, and demand and receive its answer. And up in the inmost recesses of the heart of the wilderness, Jesus wrestled in spirit with himself for many days, without food or nourishment, and without shelter. And the struggle was terrific, worthy of such a great soul. First, the body's insistent needs were to be fought and mastered. It is related that the climax of the physical struggle came one day when the instinctive mind, which attends to the physical functions, made a desperate and final demand upon him. It cried aloud for bread with all the force of its nature. It tempted him with the fact that by his own occult powers he was able to convert the very stones into bread, and it demanded that he work the miracle for his own physical needs, a practice deemed most unworthy by all true occultists and mystics. "Turn this stone into bread, and eat," cried the voice of the tempter. But Jesus resisted the temptation, although he knew that by the power of his concentrated thought, he had but first to mentally picture the stone as bread, and then will that it be so materialized. The miraculous power which afterward turned water into wine, and which was again used to feed the multitude with the loaves and the fishes, was available to him at that moment in order to satisfy the cravings of his body and to break his fast. None but the advanced occultist who has known what it was to be tempted to use his mysterious powers to satisfy his personal wants can appreciate the nature of the struggle through which Jesus passed, and from which he emerged victorious. And like the occult master that he was, he summoned his inner forces and beat off the tempter. But a still greater temptation than this arose to try him to the utmost. He found himself brought face to face with the idea of messiahship and kingship of the Jews, of which we spoke. Was he the Messiah? And if so, what must be his course of life and action? Was he destined to throw aside the robe and staff of the ascetic, and to don the royal purple and the scepter? Was he to forsake the role of the spiritual guide and teacher, and to become the king and ruler over the people of Israel? These were the questions he asked his soul, and for which he demanded an answer. And the mystic legends tell us that his spirit answered by showing him two sets of mental pictures, with the assurance that he could choose either, at will, and cause it to become realized. The first picture showed him true to his spiritual instincts and loyal to his mission, but which rendered him indeed the man of sorrows. He saw himself continuing to sow the seeds of truth, which would, centuries after, spring up, blossom and bear fruit to nourish the world, but which would now bring down upon his head the hatred and persecution of those in power and authority. And he saw each successive step, each showing the approach of the end, until at last he saw himself crowned with thorns and meeting the death of a criminal on the cross, between two base criminals of the lowest classes of men. All this he saw, and even his brave heart felt a deadly sickness at the ignominious end of it all, the apparent failure of his earthly mission. But it is related that some of the mighty intelligences which dwell upon the higher planes of existence gathered around him and gave him words of encouragement and hope and resolve. He found himself literally in the midst of the heavenly host and receiving the inspiration of its presence. Then this picture and the host of invisible helpers faded away, and the second picture began to appear before the vision of the lonely dweller of the wilderness. He saw the picture of himself descending the mountain and announcing himself as the Messiah, the King of the Jews, who had come to lead his chosen people to victory and deliverance. He saw himself acclaimed as the promised one of Israel, and the multitude flocking to his banners. He saw himself at the head of a great conquering army, marching toward Jerusalem. He saw himself making use of his highly developed occult powers to read the minds of the enemy, and thus know their every movement and intention, and the means to overcome them. He saw himself miraculously arming and feeding his hosts of battle. He saw himself smiting the enemy with his occult powers and forces. He saw the yoke of Rome being cast off, and its phalanxes fleeing across the borders in terror and disgraceful defeat. He saw himself mounting the throne of David, his forefather. He saw himself instituting a reign of the highest type, which would make of Israel the leading nation of the world. He saw Israel's sphere of influence extending in all directions, until Persia, Egypt, Greece, and even the once feared Rome become tributary nations. He saw himself in the triumphant chariot on some great feast day of victory, with Caesar himself tied to the tail of his chariot, a slave to Israel's king. He saw his royal court outrivaling that of Solomon and becoming the center of the world. He saw Jerusalem as the capital of the world, and he, Jesus of Nazareth, son of David the King, as its ruler, its hero, its demigod. The very apotheosis of human success showed in the picture of himself and his beloved Israel in the picture. And then the temple was seen to be the center of the religious thought of the world. The religion of the Jews, as modified by his own advanced views, would be the religion of all men, and he would be the favored mouthpiece of the God of Israel. All the dreams of the Hebrew fathers would be realized in him, the Messiah of the new Israel, whose capital would be Jerusalem, the Queen of the world. And all this by simply the exercise of his occult powers under the direction of his will. It is related that accompanying this second picture, and attracted by its mighty power, came all the great thought waves of the world, which had been thought by men of all times who thought and acted out the dreams of power. These clouds settled down upon him like a heavy fog, and their vibrations were almost overpowering. And also came the hosts of the disembodied souls of those who while living had sought or gained power. And each strove to beat into his brain the desire of power. Never in the history of man have the powers of darkness so gathered together for attack upon the mind of a mortal man. Would it have been any wonder had even such a man as Jesus succumbed? But he did not succumb. Rallying his inner force to his rescue, he beat back the attacking horde, and by an effort of his will, he swept both picture and tempters away into oblivion, crying indignantly, "Thou darest to tempt even me, thy Lord and Master. Get thee behind me, thou fiends of darkness." And so the temptation of the wilderness failed, and Jesus received his answer from his soul, and he descended the mountains, back to the haunts of men, back to the scene of his 3 years' labors and suffering, and back to his death. And he knew full well all that awaited him there. For had he not seen the first picture? Jesus had chosen his career. The Master descended from the mountains and forsook the wilderness for the place in which John and his followers were gathered. Resting for a time and refreshing himself with food and drink, he gathered together his energies for his great work. The followers of John gathered around him, filled with the idea that he was the Messiah, come to lead them to victory and triumph. But he disappointed them by his calm, simple manner, and his disavowal of royal claims. "What seek ye of me?" he asked them, and many, abashed, left his circle and returned to the crowd. But a few humble souls remained, and around these few gathered a few more, until at last a little band of faithful students was formed, the first band of Christian disciples. This band was composed almost entirely of fishermen and men of similar humble occupations. There was an absence of people of rank or social position. His people were of the plain people, which have furnished the recruits for every great religion. And after a time, Jesus moved away from the place, followed by his band of disciples, which drew new members from each place of gathering. Some stayed but for a short time, while others replaced the faint-hearted ones of little faith. But the band steadily grew, until it began to attract the attention of the authorities and the public. Jesus constantly disclaimed being the Messiah, but the report that such indeed he was began to spread, and the authorities began that system of spying and watching which followed his footsteps for 3 years, and which finally resulted in his death on the cross. And this suspicion was encouraged by the Jewish priesthood, which began to hate the young teacher whose opposition to their tyranny and formalism was quite marked. The band one day came to a small village in Galilee, and Jesus began his usual meetings and teaching. Near where they gathered was a house at which preparations were being made for a wedding feast. The wedding ceremony has always been an important occasion among the Jews. The most elaborate preparations consistent with the size of the purse of the girl's parents are indulged in. Relatives from far and near gather to the feast. Jesus happened to be a distant kinsman of the bride, and according to custom, he was bidden to the feast. The guests began to gather, each depositing his sandals in the outer court, and entering the guest chamber barefooted, after carefully bathing his feet and ankles, after the custom still prevailing in Oriental countries. Jesus was accompanied by a few of his faithful followers. His mother and his several brothers were also among the blood relations present at the feast. His appearance caused much interest and comment among the other guests. To some, he was simply a traveling religious teacher, not uncommon in that land. To others, he was an inspired prophet, bringing a wonderful message to the Jewish people, as he had to the Persians, Egyptians, and Hindus. To others, he was more than this, and whispers of, "He is the Messiah," "the King of Israel," etc., began to circulate among those present, causing interest, uneasiness, or disgust, according to the views of the hearers. But whenever he moved, he attracted attention by his manner, attitude, and expression. All felt that here indeed was an individual. Strange stories of his wanderings in strange lands added additional interest to his presence. A feeling that something unusual was about to happen began to creep over the crowd, as is the case often preceding such events. Mary, his mother, watched her son with longing eyes, for she saw that some strange change had come over him that was beyond her comprehension. Toward the end of the feast, it began to be whispered around among the near relatives that the supply of wine was about exhausted, the attendance having been much greater than had been expected. This, to a Jewish family, was akin to a family disgrace, and anxious looks began to be exchanged among the members of the immediate family. Tradition has it that Jesus was besought for aid by his mother and other female kinswomen. Just what they expected him to do is not clear, but it is probable that they unconsciously recognized his greatness and accorded him the place of the natural head of the family, as being the most prominent member. At any rate, they asked his aid. What arguments they used, or what reasons they urged, we do not know, but whatever they were, they succeeded in winning him to their side, and gaining from him a promise of aid and assistance. But not until after he had remonstrated that these things were of no concern of his, that his powers were not to be trifled away in this manner, but his love for his mother, and his desire to reward her devotion and faith in him, prevailed over the natural disinclination of the mystic to be a wonder-worker, and to exhibit his occult powers to grace a wedding feast. He had long since learned the necessary but comparatively simple occult feat from his old masters in far-off India, that land of wonder-working. He knew that even the humbler yogis of that land would smile at the working of such a simple miracle. And so the matter seemed to him to be of but slight moment, and not as a prostitution of some of the higher occult powers. And feeling thus, he yielded to their requests for aid. Then, moving toward the court, in which were stored a number of great jars of water, he fixed a keen, burning glance upon them, one by one, passing his hand rapidly over them. In a quick succession, he made the mental image that precedes all such manifestations of occult power, and then, manifesting his power by using his will in the manner known to all advanced occultists, he rapidly materialized the elements of the wine in the water within the jars, and lo, the miracle had been wrought. A wave of excitement passed over the crowded house. The guests flocked around the jars to taste of the wine that had been produced by occult power. The priests frowned their displeasure, and the authorities sneered and whispered charlatan, fraud, shameful imposture, and other expressions that always follow an occurrence of this kind. Jesus turned away, in grief and sorrow. Among the Hindus, such a simple occult occurrence would have caused but little comment, while here among his own people it was considered to be a wonderful miracle by some, while others regarded it as a trick of a traveling conjurer and charlatan. What manner of people were these to whom he had decided to deliver the message of life? And, sighing deeply, he passed from the house and returned to his camp. Summary. Jesus' ministry began with the baptism by John the Baptist and his subsequent initiation in the wilderness. This trial was a profound spiritual test in which Jesus faced temptation, overcame his lower nature, and emerged as a fully realized spiritual master. Key takeaways. The wilderness experience symbolizes the inner battle we all face, the struggle between the ego and the divine self. Jesus' power stemmed from his inner mastery over fear, temptation, and doubt. Spiritual strength is forged in silence, solitude, and stillness. Action items. Dedicate time for solitude each week. Allow stillness to reveal your inner strength. When faced with doubt or fear, pause and ask, "What would my higher self choose?" Visualize yourself walking through a spiritual wilderness, emerging stronger and clearer.
To continue listening, step deeper into the wisdom at Next Level Soul TV, where sacred teachings, spiritual cinema, transformative courses, and divine stories await your soul's unfolding. Enter the portal at www.nextlevelsoul.tv and let your spirit remember what it already knows. Awaken, expand, and evolve.